12 Britons were rescued, along with 12 Egyptian crew and guides. It's believed the fire was caused by an electrical short circuit. The Foreign Office has confirmed it's in contact with Egyptian authorities and assisting those involved. One of Boris Johnson's allies said the resignations of 2 Tory MPs was not a coordinated attempt to undermine the Prime Minister. Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg says there is no plot against Rishi Sunak and he believes he should remain leader. He also suggested Mr Johnson could return to Westminster, saying he could easily get back into Parliament at the next election. Well, the former PM announced he was stepping down as an MP after he was handed the finding of the Partygate inquiry. Sir Jacob says there could be a split if some MPs try to block his return, but he admits some things could have been done better.
One always deserves blame for one's own mistakes. It would be absurd of me to pretend that Boris hasn't made mistakes. There was a man called Peter Wentworth who in the late 16th century was locked up in the Tower for saying in the House of Commons, "None is without fault, no, not our gracious Queen." The same could be said of Boris. None is without fault, no, not our gracious Boris. That is true of all of us.
Well, meanwhile, Leave campaigner Nigel Farage believes it's the end for Boris Johnson with the Conservatives. But the GBNews presenter told Camilla Tominey he's been talking to Tory MPs about potentially joining a new party.
The good side of Boris, of course, is, just look at today's newspapers.
Yes.
He's very good at dominating news.
Yeah.
He does have personality. He does make people smile. And if he wants to defend his Brexit legacy,
yeah.
well, I want to defend my Brexit legacy too. So would there be a possibility of a new coming together on the centre-right? It'd be Boris Johnson. There'd be other MPs that would join in with this as well.
Have you discussed this with Boris Johnson?
Not with him directly, no. But I have discussed it with people very close to him.
Well, in other news this afternoon, yellow thunderstorm warnings have been issued as temperatures continue to climb across the country. The Met Office says the alerts affect parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, England and Wales, and they'll be in force until 9 o'clock tomorrow night. Well, temperatures are expected to hit 32 degrees today. Ukraine says its counter-offensive against Russia is underway. President Zelensky says he's optimistic about regaining lost territory. It's after Ukraine said its forces had advanced up to 2,000 metres along the front line near the eastern city of Bakhmut. Russia is disputing those claims. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now, though, it's over to Nana.
Good afternoon. It's fast approaching 4 minutes after 3 o'clock. This is GB News on TV, online and on digital radio. I'm Nana Akua, and some breaking news to bring you in the last few moments. Nicola Sturgeon has been arrested in the investigation into the SNP's finances. Police Scotland have said. Joining us now, though, is Deputy Political Commentator Nigel Nelson and former Brexit Party MEP Martin Daubney. Huge news. I mean, that's massive news. I'm not being funny. My mum will be pleased because she hates her. My mum said, I just can't stand that woman. That's how my mum feels about Nicola Sturgeon. But a lot of people love her. And she was a big figurehead in the SNP. She was literally the person who kind of transformed the image of the party and brought it to the forefront to where it was now, one of the most powerful political things in Scotland. Yeah. I mean, what do you make of all of this?
I think there's a certain sense of Mr. Bond, I've been expecting you about this. As in, it just felt since the arrest of her husband, Peter Morrell, and then the motorhome, and it just felt like this was going to have continuity and will go further. We obviously can't speculate about what's going on, but you would expect a sort of full financial probe. And this centres around money raised for the independence cause. Where did the money go? That's the big question. And I think it runs a coach and horses through the competence and the ability, I think, of the SNP as a whole. They're already, I think, 10, 12 or plus years behind in terms of the independence movement. I just think the entire ground is crumbling now beneath the SNP. The Labour Party will be licking their lips in anticipation of the capabilities they have north of the border I think this is curtains for the SNP.
Yeah, what was your take on that, Nigel? Because obviously Humza Yusuf, a lot of people calling him Humza useless. He's had a nightmare run. Literally almost everything he's touched has crumbled. And now with this potential, do you see a future for the SNP?
Well, I mean, that's going to be the big question. That certainly a lot of supporters, because bear in mind it's their money. The £600,000 was raised, and the promise was it would be spent on campaigning for independence. So if that money has disappeared, then supporters will be furious and they would melt away. I don't think it's the end of the SNP as such, but it might be the end of their huge popularity in Scotland. And as you say, that Labour would be are the net beneficiaries of this. This could actually deliver them the seats they need, not to have a minority government down here.
Well, that was the thing, wasn't it? It would have been a coalition with potentially the SNP and also the Liberal Democrats. It would have been a nightmare coalition. But now it looks like if Labour are the beneficiaries of these seats, which, as you know, a lot of people in Scotland will not vote Tory no matter what, they are the only next best option, really.
Yes, it's bad news for the Conservatives because the net recipients of a collapse in the SNP vote would most naturally be the Labour Party. But I think now we're at the stage of show us the receipts. Show us the receipts. Where did this money go? Where's it been donated from whom? And every single donor at grassroots level will have a direct requirement and an entitlement to say, where's my money? Show us where this went.
Well, I think, obviously, this is the full investigation.
That's where we're at.
What we will find out. But joining us now is our Deputy Political Reporter, Tom Harwood. Tom, can you bring us up to date as to what we can say, what we do know?
Well, we do know that Police Scotland launched an investigation into possible SNP fundraising fraud, known as Operation Branchform, back as early as 2021. Now, no arrests were made as part of that operation until April this year, when, on the 5th of April, Peter Morrell, the former chief executive of the SNP, and indeed husband to Nicola Sturgeon, was sensationally arrested, questioned for 12 hours, and indeed their family home searched in Glasgow. And then around a week later, the former treasurer of the SNP, Colin Beattie, was arrested on the 18th of April this year. But there was one more name on SNP financial documents, not just the chief executive of the party, not just the treasurer of the party, but also the leader of the party, Nicola Sturgeon. And today, on the 11th of June, we have seen the arrest and questioning of Nicola Sturgeon. She currently sits in police custody. And as part of this Operation Branchform from Police Scotland, she will be questioned on this possible fundraising fraud within the SNP. Many reports of a missing £600,000 that was raised specifically for a referendum campaign that appears to have vanished into thin air.
Wow. I mean, well, we'll keep an eye on that. Tom will stay with us. Hopefully we can stay abreast on that story. Joining me now is our political editor at The Express, David Maddox. David, I mean, this is big news, obviously, with Nicola Sturgeon being put into custody in that way. The SNP are in a lot of trouble with regard to their membership base. What are your thoughts regarding it? Where does the SNP go from here?
Oh, hi, Nana. It's huge news. And as Martin was saying, it was not unexpected. Nicola Sturgeon was one of the three signatories on the financial documents. And it felt inevitable that she might get arrested, as the other two had been, including her husband, Peter Morrell. Of course, that doesn't mean, of course, whether we like her or dislike her, and, people are fairly divided on Nicola Sturgeon. That doesn't mean that she's guilty or not guilty. We need to allow the process to go through. But I'd just like to disagree with with Nigel and with Martin on one thing. I don't think this is the end of the SNP at all. And I think if any of their political opponents believe that, then they've been extremely complacent, especially Labour. There is, since the 2014 referendum, I say this as a former Scotsman hack who covered Scottish politics for 8 years, there has been a solid support for independence that goes beyond the SNP. It is people are unwavering on it, and the political party which is the form they try to get independence from is always the SNP. And we're seeing actually that with the polls, there was a dip as a result of all the corruption allegations and so forth, but the SNP is still leading. So anybody who's writing them off now does so at their own danger, even with Humza useless, as some people are calling him, in charge.
Well, thank you for that, David. Interesting there. What about the Alba party, though? Because there's the Alba party led by Salmond, and he might be looking at that and thinking, well, this is an opportunity for him.
Yes, he will be, and he has been. The trouble is he had his own legal issues. Of course, he came through them, but since he launched the Alba party, it just never has taken root at all. And it tends to be older, more kind of eccentric members of the SNP who have backed it. There's never been a massive split. Most of the SNP people, even ones who dislike Nicola Sturgeon, and there's plenty of them who dislike Nicola Sturgeon, have stuck with the party. My feeling is that they're going to get a drubbing in the general election next year, which they don't really care about as much. But Humza Yousaf will then be removed, and there will be a restart, a refresh for the SNP with Kate Forbes. I think that's the plan for a lot of them. And then they will go in a different direction, have a new leadership, and things will be, back on track as far as they're concerned.
Well, thank you for that, David. Thank you so much. Good to talk to you. That's David Maddox. He's the political editor of The Express. And, of course, Nicola Sturgeon, as I just have a note here, with regard to Nicola Sturgeon, a spokesperson for Nicola Sturgeon said that the former SNP leader voluntarily attended an interview with Police Scotland and that she would said that she would cooperate with the investigation. So that is where we are with Nicola Sturgeon.
Yeah, it's funny what David said there about the end of the SNP. What I meant was that they're a single-issue party, ostensibly. OK, they tend to they're running the NHS badly, they're running schools badly, but really they're about independence. And if that's derailed, not only through the sort of competence and the financial misdemeanours, but terrible policy decisions, like the gender recognition bill, which was so utterly and out of step with the voters.
But the Labour Party supported that, though, didn't they?
Well, that should haunt Keir Starmer too.
Well, it's not, is it? You can't even say what a woman is. That's the problem we have there. I think
every single one of these politicians should be hounded on that question. What is a woman? Can a woman have a penis? What about women's rights? But unfortunately, that gets lost in the wash in terms of the bigger issues. But it feels to me like a party completely out of touch with reality, and that's what happens in the end. I think they don't understand what the voters want in terms of things like the gender recognition bill. They get kind of drunk on the power, and then the money comes into play. There's a sort of Animal Farm feel about this to me. I really do think.
Do you think?
I do think that this is the case of being drunk on power and just being completely out of touch with the voters.
It seems to be a standard thing, though, when somebody's been in power for too long, after a certain period of time, it seems to get to their heads and then they become drunk on that power, and then they kind of seem to think that they are sort of indestructible and invincible. And that Nicola Sturgeon did feel like almost an a fantastic force.
Every government loses its way after a while. I reckon about 13 years is the maximum.
Yeah.
There was marked the end of Margaret Thatcher. It marked the end of New Labour. It may well be where we are now with the Tory government. It'll mark the end of them too, on the basis of the 13 years. She also has been in power a long time, or rather the SNP has, and that's why I rather thought when she gave up, she actually chose the right time to do it. Now, of course, what we don't know is how much the financial issues played a part in that. I was happy to believe what she said, because I think that she's a consummate politician, that actually she just had enough.
It came too quickly for me, in my view. And when you think about the gender recognition reform bill, that seems like nothing compared to this. This is like that was literally the least of her worries, which is, I wonder how much she knew as to why she decided to leave. I mean, because it was so sudden, really. To me, it was actually quite a shock.
Yeah.
To a lot of people in her party, it was a shock. And then suddenly there were police at her house, sort of thing. So it felt like there was some other knowledge in there.
And I think actually there are parallels with Boris Johnson's departure from the Conservative Party. He knew what was coming, and I think Sturgeon knew what was coming. And in the end, you know, you sort of jump before you pushed, I think.
Do you think, I mean, she may not have known anything, but it does feel like a bit of a coincidence that suddenly, you know, literally within a week or so, the police were there. But we don't know. Obviously, there was a lot of questions over the finances, and they hadn't answered certain questions as well when they were asked with regard to it. So it is interesting how it will play out.
Yeah, I mean, and also bear in mind that her house was searched way back in April, so this has been a long, ongoing police investigation.
And obviously Boris Johnson hasn't actually left the Tory party, he's just stepped down as MP, so he's still sort of there. But I think if they had their own way, they will get rid of him. It does feel like that's the sort of direction of travel. Well, what do you think then with regard to Humza useless, as even David Maddox called him? Obviously, I'll honour his name. It is Humza Yousaf.
Yeah.
But he has not cut through at all, has he?
No, well, what's happened is he hasn't had the charisma of Sturgeon. Part of Sturgeon's problem is that she was so omnipresent, so powerful, so charismatic. There wasn't a natural successor, and she didn't groom a successor because she didn't want somebody to take over from her. I think what that created was a vacuum of personality, a vacuum of talent. And so what we have is Yousaf, who's put through some of the most ridiculous laws, especially around free speech. The free speech laws in Scotland are some of the most draconian in the Western world. For example, the Scottish rapist, the double rapist, the trans rapist, when they said that he should go into a women's jail, and on the hustings for the leadership contention, when Yousaf said that he wasn't a real trans woman, he fell foul of his own hate speech laws. That's how absurd things are in Scotland now. You can't speak truth without it being a hate crime. And the voters in Scotland, I think, just are looking on aghast at what's happening to the country, and get away from things like the terrible drug addiction issues, the terrible state of the NHS, the terrible state of schools, public services. You know, the nuts and bolts of competence and governance are on the floor in Scotland. And they get sidetracked by minutiae around free speech and can a woman have a penis? And people just think, get a grip. Get in the real world and sort the country out. Meanwhile, there's all this kind of financial stuff going on, which makes people think, these people don't represent me at all anymore. So I do think the SNP are in grave, grave peril. If they are the baton carriers of the independence movement, I think it's whole below the water for a generation.
Do you think perhaps they wish that they'd voted and picked Kate Forbes instead? Because Kate Forbes definitely had a bit more. I liked her, you know, her presence. I liked some of the comments that she made with regard to Humza Yousaf. There was that fantastic question that she asked him with regard to his current reign with regard to his leadership when he was going for leadership. When she said, "Well, with all the things that have gone wrong when you were health minister and so on and so forth, what makes you think you can actually lead the party?" Do you think that perhaps they're sort of quite remorseful that they didn't pick her instead?
Well, I mean, I think it was a terribly bitter leadership contest, that one, and some of those remarks she was making about a colleague that she would have to work with later, I thought was astonishing. I thought that Humza Yousaf, all the way through, when I was talking to SNP MPs, was the most likely winner because, generally speaking, he was the continuity candidate. He was the one most likely to continue with the kind of things that Nicola Sturgeon had put forward. And you mentioned the gender recognition bill. I mean, I'm personally in favour of that particular piece of legislation. However, I do appreciate that Scots voters weren't. There was something like sort of 3 in 5 were against it, and it seems to me, from a political point of view, that was a mistake to force that one through.
But there's a whole conversation around that data. So what happened was the numbers that the SNP put forward for the voters in favour of it, it was actually work done for by charities that the SNP bankrolled. So ostensibly, the data, I think, was unrepresentative of what the voters actually believed in. And I think that's the problem. It's like, we're going to get the result we want. And I think you're dead right, Nigel. You know, after a while, things just run their course. And, you know, politicians just run out of road. That's what's happened.
Well, let's speak to the deputy political commentator who will be joining us in a moment. But joining us now, if you just tuned in, is Nigel Nelson, who's deputy political commentator, and also former Brexit Party MEP Martin Daubney. Now let's have a chat with the deputy editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. Henry, is this news a surprise to you? Nicola Sturgeon has been, she's apparently been arrested.
Well, it was always likely, I think, at some point. It's a surprise that it happened this weekend. I think after all the stuff with Boris Johnson, I was looking forward to having a Sunday afternoon in which nothing much else could possibly happen. But here we are. But, you know, Nicola Sturgeon was First Minister of Scotland for 8 years. Her husband, Peter Murrell, who was previously arrested by Police Scotland, was Chief Executive of the party for 20 years. And there was always, you know, even when they were both on top, as it were, there was always problems and questions about having that much control over the party within one household. But one thing that certainly meant is it was never plausible that if you had major problems with the SNP's finances, that Peter Murrell as Chief Executive would know, but that he wouldn't have discussed it with his wife, the First Minister. So I think given that he was arrested, the question is more, where did this 2-month delay come from?
Exactly, because within that period, obviously the police have been investigating this. And I'm wondering now, with regard to the SNP, and obviously with Humza Yousaf in charge now, do you see, because speaking previously, David Maddox suggested that there is still a big appetite for independence. Do you still think that is the case in Scotland?
I think there's a big latent appetite for independence. You know, the referendum did move the baseline for independence up to about 40-45% of the Scottish electorate. That hasn't changed. The polling on the principle is still fairly narrow, but the gap and the problem for the SNP from the beginning has always been translating the large number of voters who support the sort of vague idea, including as it is the idea of no longer being governed by the Tories in London and all the rest of it, and then turning that into a reality when you face up to all the huge difficulties that an independent Scotland would face. And what this means is that those problems, they have become much more acute. Nicola Sturgeon, she could have remained a major asset to the independence cause if the SNP had been in a position to revisit the issue in 5 or 6 years' time. What this means is that the SNP is hugely damaged. Nicola Sturgeon is hugely damaged. It's going to make it much more difficult to sell.
But is this not, I mean, everyone's sort of looking at this as if to say that the natural SNP voter will now turn to the Labour Party. But, I mean, what about the Conservatives? Are they offering much? And do you feel that at the moment they've got more MPs there than the Labour Party at the moment? So is this not also an opportunity for the Conservative Party? I mean, obviously there's a lot of things going on with the Tories right now, but do you see the Conservatives potentially picking up some of the votes from the SNP?
Potentially. The SNP is an incredibly broad coalition, but partly because they're just united by independence. They encompass voters who believe in a huge range of things. The SNP became Scotland's dominant party by taking loads of Labour voters, and so Labour will gain the most if the SNP start to retreat back to where they used to be. But yes, certainly there are parts of Scotland, more centre-right parts in the northeast, for example, where the Conservatives are the main challengers, and if there does turn into a kind of general let's boot this lot out mindset, which every electorate has from time to time, the Tories would be the principal beneficiary of that, yes.
Well, that would be interesting to see, and obviously the Labour Party must be licking their lips now, thinking, gosh, we're going to clean up, we don't even need to worry about potentially a coalition government, or, because they think that potentially they'll have enough MPs now to represent in the next election. The Tories are doing a disastrous job at the moment. Whilst we're on it, what are your thoughts there as we're looking at the Conservative Party imploding?
Well, I mean, the departure of Boris Johnson it's not a planned strategic exercise. You know, he and a few of his closest allies resigning, the by-elections will be awkward, and yes, it might destabilise the government if all those by-elections go badly. But there's clearly no plan. There's no idea of what they're going to do next. There's no coordinated effort to try and take back power from Rishi Sunak. It really is just kind of trying to bring down the Prime Minister and do as much damage as possible. I think the question is, if they've all left Parliament, if Boris is outside the House of Commons, is he going to be as well positioned as he might have been to take advantage of the chaos that will follow if the Conservatives lose the election? I think that personally he might have been better off being in Parliament, but we'll see.
Well, one thing you're right about that, Henry, is that there clearly is no plan at all with the Conservative Party. Henry, thank you very much for joining me. He's the Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. Right, so if you just joined us, welcome on board. This is GB News. We're live on TV, online and on digital radio. It's fast approaching 25 minutes after 3 o'clock. I'm Nana Akua. Joining me live, Nigel Nelson and also Martin Daubeny. But you may not have heard, but if you haven't already, Nicola Sturgeon has been arrested, and we've been talking about it. We'll be talking about it for the next hour. Joining me now is our Scottish political editor of the Daily Mail, Michael Blackley. Michael, thank you for joining me. A lot of people saying they're not surprised by this news at all. Are you?
Well, I think what's certainly the case is that it's an absolutely astonishing development, real bombshell development for Scottish politics and British politics. It has, I mean, in many ways, it has been a matter of time before this day came, because there's three names on the SNP's accounts: Peter Murrow, the chief executive, the treasurer Colin Beattie, and Nicola Sturgeon, and she was the only one of those three who hadn't been arrested until today. So it was certainly an expectation that as part of this investigation into the SNP's finances, she would eventually be questioned by police, and that day has come now, and it really has a potential to have a big impact on the reputation of someone who's one of the biggest figures in British politics and is Scotland's longest serving First Minister of all time.
A lot of the big names are falling at the moment, doesn't it? All these big character politicians who we kind of almost elected because of their charisma, now a lot of this is falling away. In terms of the Scotland and then, of course, the EU, how do you think that will fare with the people in Scotland? Do you think that they'll be still considering that they want an independent Scotland and that maybe they'd want that to be part of the EU? Or do you think they've got their hands full with their own domestic politics and are more concerned about Humza Yousaf?
Well, I think that this issue does have the potential to have an impact on support for independence. But I think what we should maybe point out, first of all, is, as Humza Yousaf acknowledged in an interview this morning, there is not majority support, consistent majority support for independence in Scotland. And I think that is already a problem for the SNP and for independence supporters. There's been some polls that have given the SNP a majority, given the independence campaign a majority, but not many. So it isn't the settled position of the Scottish public by any means at the moment. And I think there is a bit of panic within the SNP that this is going to have a big impact on their popularity. And clearly the SNP are the party of independence. So without the SNP doing well, it's very difficult to see the campaign for independence going anywhere anytime soon.
Are they still hemorrhaging their memberships as well? Because people were leaving in their droves, especially with the gender recognition reform bill that started off this sort of snowball effect of people leaving the party as they're leaving their membership. And now this, I'm wondering, where is their membership now in terms of, I mean, they lost, 30% within a few months of the gender recognition reform bill. Where are they now?
Yeah, so the latest figure that the SNP have used is around 75,000 members, which it's way down from the peak. It was up at about 120,000 plus at one stage, so it is way down. But we have to point out that 75,000 is by far and away bigger than the other parties in Scotland. So it's still a large membership that they have. I think the concern for them will possibly be more with voters and with donors, because there were figures just last week that showed that in the first 3 months of this year, the only donation that the SNP received was one donation of £4,000 from somebody who was deceased. So that was small fry compared to the sort of donations to Labour and the Conservatives, and that's a real concern, that the funding has dried up. And I think the big concern for the SNP will be looking at the recent polls, that they all seem to be suggesting that support for the SNP is moving backwards. Now, we don't know what's going to happen with the Nicola Sturgeon interview today and the wider police investigation. We don't know if there's going to be any charges pressed against anyone, but there's no question that such a huge moment where this big political beast of the SNP is interviewed by police, I mean, it has the potential to have big ramifications for the SNP's popularity.
We'll keep our eyes on this story. Michael Blackley, thank you very much for joining me. He's a Scottish political editor for the Daily Mail. Thank you, Michael. An SNP spokesperson said that these issues are subject to a live police investigation. The SNP have been cooperating fully with this investigation and will continue to do so. However, it is not appropriate to publicly address any issues whilst that investigation is ongoing, and we will obviously avoid all that. But we obviously, this is a big story, and we need to keep our eyes focused on what is actually happening there. But stay tuned. This is GBNews. We're live on TV, online and digital radio. It's just coming up to 31 minutes after 3 o'clock time to get your latest news headlines with Aaron Armstrong.
Good afternoon to you. It's 3:30. Well, as we've just been hearing, Nicola Sturgeon's been arrested by police investigating SNP finances and funding. The former First Minister is in custody, being questioned by detectives. A spokesperson for the former SNP leader says she voluntarily attended an interview and has consistently said she will cooperate with the investigation. In April, her husband, Peter Murrell, who was the Scottish National Party's chief executive, was arrested and released without charge, pending further inquiries. Their home and the SNP headquarters were also searched, with police seen removing boxes of evidence. 3 British tourists are missing after a dive boat burst into flames in the Red Sea off Egypt. Officials say 12 Britons were rescued along with 12 Egyptian crew and guides. The Foreign Office has confirmed it's in contact with Egyptian authorities and is assisting those involved. One of Boris Johnson's allies says the resignations of 2 Tory MPs was not a coordinated attempt to undermine the Prime Minister. Jacob Rees-Mogg says there's no plot against Rishi Sunak, and he believes Sunak should remain leader. He also suggested Mr Johnson could return to Westminster, saying he could easily get back into Parliament at the next election.
One always deserves blame for one's own mistakes. It would be absurd of me to pretend that Boris hasn't made mistakes. There was a man called Peter Wentworth who in the late 16th century was locked up in the Tower for saying in the House of Commons, "None is without fault, no, not our gracious Queen." The same could be said of Boris. None is without fault, no, not our gracious Boris. That is true of all of us.
Well, the Met Office has warned almost a month's rain could fall over parts of the UK over the next 12 hours. That is as temperatures continue to soar. 30 degrees recorded once again, this time in Suffolk. It could reach 32. Yellow thunderstorm alerts have been issued for parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, England and Wales, which will be in force until 9 p.m. tomorrow. And more on all of our stories on our website, gbnews.com. Now, back to Nana.
Good afternoon. This is GB News. We are the People's Channel. We're live on TV, online and on digital radio. I'm Nana Akua. Joining me in the studio is Martin Daubney and also Nigel Nelson. And of course, we are still talking about that breaking news in the last hour that former SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon has been arrested in the investigation into the SNP's finances. Now, Police Scotland have reported that to us just a few moments ago. So if you've just joined me, stay with us. We'll be keeping our eye on that story. But right now, should we go over to Tom Harwood? Let's go straight over to Tom Harwood. Let's get an update with our political reporter, Tom Harwood. Tom, so just give us an update of what's been happening.
Well, it's important to remember the context in which we're talking. The Police Scotland have had what's known as Operation Branchform running since 2021. This is an investigation into SNP party finances and possible fraud within SNP party fundraising. It's resulted in 3 arrests so far. Firstly, the husband of Nicola Sturgeon, Peter Murrell. He was the chief executive of the party. He was arrested at the beginning of April. Next, the former party treasurer was arrested. That was around halfway through April. And today, now the former leader of the party, Nicola Sturgeon, has been arrested as well. The previous 2 arrests have been, of course, released without charge. But after lengthy questioning and indeed searches that have taken place, there was a very lengthy search of the family home of Nicola Sturgeon and Peter Murrell in April, and this investigation continues to go on. It's not clear how long Nicola Sturgeon will be questioned for by Police Scotland, but as I say, she remains in police custody, being questioned as we speak.
Well, Tom, with all this story kind of breaking at the moment, are we getting an idea of what's kind of going on in Scotland in terms of the political vibe there? Obviously, a lot of the Scottish channels reporting this story. What kind of thing? What are they saying there?
It's fascinating because since this story broke, the fortunes of the SNP have been falling. We can track the general opinion polls within Scotland that have seen the SNP, while still maintaining a fairly strong base of support, their absolute level has been declining, and declining rather precipitously. What we have seen is many projections that show the SNP will not get a majority of seats north of the border at the next general election, which would blow back in the face of Nicola Sturgeon's own plan for a quasi-referendum to be made of that general election. She would say that had the majority of seats in Scotland gone to the SNP, that would be a mandate for independence. Well, even on that peculiar calculation, it looks like now, according to polling, that would not be the case. The SNP would fall short of that mark. But there will be a real-world test, in all likelihood, as to whether this severe knock in polling support for the SNP is going to affect the real world. And that is in the constituency of one Margaret Ferrier, the individual who was elected as an SNP MP back in 2019, but moved to be an independent MP after being booted out of the party for a really rather flagrant breach of COVID rules, travelling halfway across the country after taking a test when she was supposed to be isolating. That could well result in a by-election sooner rather than later, as her now suspension from the House for 30 days triggers a recall petition.
Well, listen, thank you so much. That's Tom Harwood, our Deputy Political Editor. Good to talk to you, Tom. While joining me now in studio, Martin Daubeny and Nigel Nelson. I'm going to come to you, Nigel. So we've got this. We now know, obviously, Nicola Sturgeon has been arrested. What are your thoughts on what Tom was saying there?
Well, I mean, the important thing is that she has been arrested as a suspect, and she's not. That's the word the police are using, not the word witness, which is a significant difference between the two. I mean, I think, as far as Scottish politics are concerned, that obviously it can't be good for the SNP. As Tom just mentioned, we've got the by-election which will be coming up for Margaret Ferrier. Yes. Net beneficiary of all this, and why it's so important, would be Keir Starmer, if he can make inroads into SNP territory. And why it's so important for him is, at the moment, all the suggestions are, especially after local elections, he's looking at a minority government, a hang parliament here. Great if he can get 20 MPs in Scotland and have an outright majority.
Well, there are other parties, though. I mean, there's Reform. I mean, I don't know whether they're heading up to Scotland or doing something. There are other parties that could potentially mop up some of these votes. The Conservative Party, I don't know whether... I mean, they should be so lucky. What's your take on it?
I think it comes down to the basics, and that is, without trust and without competence, you have nothing, especially if you throw in a whiff of corruption. That applies to any institution, any business, any public body, and certainly a political party. And if you exist on a single ticket issue such as independence, it casts the whole thing into doubt, especially if you rely upon membership donations and donations from the public. We just heard of actually quite an amusing point from the fellow from the Scottish Daily Mail, saying the biggest donor was from someone who's dead. And that almost was funny. It's like only the dead are supporting the SNP in terms of funding. The fact of the matter is, they were also setting the illusion of rejoining the European Union, something that I was talking about all the time when we were in Brussels and Strasbourg as MEPs. I was consistently I was waving my blue card about, trying to ask an SNP MEP a question on how are you going to fund independence? How are you because unless you can be self-financing and run as a country independently, you're nothing. No more Barnett formula. No more money from Westminster. The institution you despise, you depend upon. It's like divorcing somebody you hate, but you still want the alimony. Well, now they're saying no more North Sea oil. Well, that was the underpinning of Alex Salmond's independence finances. North Sea oil was basically the big bankroll. Now they're saying no more to that because of net zero. Then we have the thorny but factually correct topic of every single member state, 27, has to approve them. Well, the Belgians won't because they have their own Flemish independence movement. The Spaniards won't because they have the Catalan independence movement. It's unicorn politics, is what I'm trying to say. They were selling the illusion of rejoin. They can't afford it. They won't get voted into it. And if they did, they'd lose the money from Westminster anyway, which would bankrupt Scotland. So Sturgeon was always selling an illusion. But now we're seeing through it.
People might say that about Brexit, though. I mean, people would say that probably about Brexit. But it's almost a contradiction in terms that they wanted to leave. You know, they were unhappy that we left the EU. Apparently, the majority in Scotland were unhappy with that. But yet, they themselves want to join the EU, yet they want independence. So it's kind of like a bit of a contradiction. That's not independence.
It was a pathological dislike of England, really. Let's be honest. That they would be independent for 5 minutes and then join Brussels.
Yeah, but
it's a bureaucratic fiefdom.
Yeah, I agree, but some would say that actually the reality there is that they just wanted to be a sovereign nation of their own, and that's why they did it. But then, as you say, it's a bit of a dichotomy that they would then want to join the EU. I wonder what that's...
Well, I think
what is that about?
There's another way of looking at it.
OK, what's your way of looking at it?
Where you turn it round. The whole point was that Scotland was quite happy about membership of the EU. So the idea that an independent nation would be completely sovereign or whatever, that wasn't a problem for Scotland. It would still mean independence from Westminster, but they voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU. And what really upset them was the fact that their votes basically didn't count on the basis that the overall UK vote decided to go for Brexit.
But they're a part of the UK.
Yeah, indeed, and so they were stuck with that. But their argument was, and why I think they have a very good argument for a second referendum, is because things have changed since 2014. They want to stay in the EU. There was no question of leaving the EU back in 2014. They do deserve a vote on whether they want to actually rejoin as an independent country.
Well, I suppose the change was a material change, and some could say that that is a material change. But others would say that it's not really. You're still part of the United Kingdom. That is what you signed up for. When you're part of the United Kingdom, if there is a vote, you are part of that vote.
Well, that's not what the SNP signed up for. The SNP, SNP obviously always existed to be independent, but Scotland and Scottish voters signed up to be part of the UK, which was part of the EU, and that's the bit they lost.
But weren't they part of the UK before being part of the EU?
Yes, they were.
Well, exactly. So Scotland was part of the United Kingdom before...
And had a democratic vote and said they wanted to stay.
But they were part of the UK before we joined the EU, which means that came within the time they were within us.
And the SNP don't give a flying fig about democratic votes. They lost the independence referendum. They wanted another go at that. They lost Brexit. They wanted another go at that. Isn't it funny?
The same thing.
Hamza Yousaf won the leadership debate by a margin of 52% to 48%.
I know, it was ironic.
And that was the only one he didn't want another go on.
Yeah.
So the point is, when they lose, they want another roll of the dice, and I'm afraid that's not how democracy works.
Well, let's go to political commentator Benedict Spence, who joins me now. Benedict, thank you very much for joining me. So this news, I ask everyone this first question as to whether it comes as a surprise to them. To me, to be honest, Nicola Sturgeon being arrested was a slight surprise to me, but was it a surprise to you at all?
The timing was, but the fact that there has been an ongoing investigation for the length of time that there is suggested that at some point, and that there were questions sort of hanging over the senior leadership of the SNP, suggested that they would want a word with Nicola Sturgeon in some capacity at some point. So I'm perhaps not entirely surprised that it has come to this. I think it's been leading in a direction of more and more senior members of the SNP being sucked into this investigation the longer it goes on.
Well, of course, the spokesperson said that these issues are subject to a live police investigation and that the SNP have been cooperating fully with the investigation and will continue to do so. However, it's not appropriate to publicly address any issues while that investigation is ongoing, and we will obviously honour that too, because we don't want to, get involved in that side of things. But if we look at it now, there's a lot of people who may well benefit quite nicely from this. One, of course, being the Labour Party, who may well have had to rely on some sort of coalition with the SNP to make sure they had a majority in the House of Parliament. But now, do you think they're going to be the main beneficiaries? I mean, and you consider their policies with regard to North Sea gas as well, oil and gas.
I was listening to the conversation between Nigel and Martin just then, and I thought it was interesting how Martin described this sort of fantasy politic that was being offered by the SNP, where you could have everything and you weren't going to have to pay for it with nasty oil North Sea oil and gas, which is a pollutant, and we'll all be able to rejoin the European Union. It'll all be fantastic. This has only really cropped up. It wasn't even, it was something that cropped up before Brexit happened, but it crept up in the aftermath of New Labour's eventual demise, was when you saw the rise of the SNP. And this is the fact that actually I don't really think Scottish nationalism as an independence movement carries as much weight as an identity. Scotland has a very strong identity in the same way that Wales and Northern Ireland does, but you don't quite see the same sort of urge for independence, say, in Wales, and that's because I think actually Welsh Labour relatively has been quite strong. This is the thing. I think Scotland operates on a much more sort of national basis when it comes to Labour Party politics, and when there is an absence of a strong Labour Party, that's when the SNP was able to fill the void, essentially as a form of anti-Toryism. I wouldn't even say anti-Englishism. I don't think that there's a lot of animosity, for example, between Scotland and parts of the north of England. I think it's very much sort of a cultural Toryism that parts of Scotland oppose. And for a very long time, there's been a dearth of any kind of influence or authority in the Labour Party in the UK. We can talk at great length about how Jeremy Corbyn won the argument, but actually they've not really been serious challengers. Keir Starmer, through patience, rather than any sort of maverick insight, through patience and stability, has been able to rebuild the Labour coalition. It's not quite there yet, but he is sort of slowly growing in impetus. Now, of course, this hasn't happened. What's happened with Nicola Sturgeon today is not as a result of Labour Party policy. But as I say, by being patient, by not saying silly things, by trying to appeal very broadly, he has built up the Labour Party's credibility. And now they, I think, are very much ready to sweep into the vacuum that's been created by them.
He's got lucky. He's got lucky by saying very little at all. But one of the things that he did say was that the banning of any new North Sea oil and gas, and that may prove to be a problem for him in Scotland, because that will be an issue, and that is a big policy that he's announced. They've already backtracked on their green policies, but this one is his latest. Do you think that this might have an impact?
I think if Keir Starmer is sensible, he will end up rowing back on that policy once he's in office. I don't think you can actually square, given that we actually do need to continue having fossil fuels, and we're currently importing a lot of it from the Gulf. I don't think you can necessarily square saying, we're going to stop new licenses. But by the way, we're going to do business with regimes that actually a lot of our voters don't necessarily like. I think that this is something to appeal to voters who may feel at this moment that the Labour Party is sewed up for the next election and might be tempted to vote Green or Lib Dem because they think it doesn't matter if I don't vote Labour because the Tories are going to be out anyway. I think this is broadly an appeal to voters in England to say, no, you need to stick with us, the Labour Party. We're the ones that are going to guarantee your fears around climate change and what have you. So I think it would be an issue in Scotland if it weren't for the fact that the SNP are imploding quite so badly. But if Keir Starmer is sensible, I think he will row back on that a little bit once he's in office.
Row back on it, yet another one of his so-called policies. Thank you, Benedict. That's Benedict Spence, his political commentator. Thank you so much. If you just joined me, welcome on board. It's 48 minutes after 3 o'clock. Joining me live, Martin Daubney, also Nigel Nelson. Martin.
I think Benedict made an excellent point there, actually, about anti-Toryism. I think it was actually incredibly clever politics, what the SNP did about demonising Westminster. It was always this sense of them and us. But there was, of course, this huge disconnect because they're dependent on the money. The Barnett formula, as I mentioned, disproportionate gives much more money to Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, but ostensibly Scotland, because it's relative levels of poverty. As a consequence, they have free prescriptions, free university education, and, the things that we don't get this side of the border, paid for by Westminster, ostensibly, or certainly underpinned hugely by it. So there's this massive disconnect between hating something and yet having to depend upon it.
Well, it's interesting. He also made a point that it wasn't so anti-England; it was more anti-Tory.
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly you see that when you're in Westminster, that the SNP as a parliamentary party in London spend all their time really going for the Tories. This is actually they really do dislike the Tories and everything they stand for. But then the SNP is a left-wing party; it's a socialist party. So, in a sense, that's what you would expect. It was interesting to mention things like North Sea oil and where Keir Starmer is. I mean, I think that his rowing back on the green agenda, that now there is some confusion about the 28 billion he promised to put into it. It looks like that'll be delayed. And his whole growth policy was made around that. I think he must get that sorted out. The North Sea oil is really important because obviously Scotland relies on the profits from it.
Well, listen, joining me now is Michelle Valentine. She's a former leader of Reform UK in Scotland. Now, Michelle, this is an interesting development. People are saying that they kind of expected it. The timing is the thing that they are sort of slightly surprised by. Was it always on the cards in your mind? And where do you think that reform could potentially stand as a result of this?
Well, I think there was an inevitability after Colin Beattie and Peter Murrell were arrested. As the third signatory to the accounts, there was an inevitability that Nicola Sturgeon would be called to account as well. So I don't think it comes as a surprise. I think the timing, really it being a Sunday more than anything else, I think most of us have been waiting for this announcement, expecting it to come. But the real question will be, will any of this now go further? Will it become charges rather than just arrests? But in terms of the future, I think what we have now is some really big questions about who knew what. And I think that will be the bit that might come back to haunt the current government, the SNP. Humza Yousaf was, of course, the Murrells candidate. He was the person they backed, that they wanted in power after Nicola Sturgeon's exit. He has claimed considerably numerous times that he was very close to Nicola Sturgeon, that he was sort of brought into being in terms of his career by the Murrells, and therefore there is a big question now for him to answer about what did he know. Was he oblivious to all the questions that are being asked, or was he indeed aware of them, and therefore does he have questions to answer too?
And do Reform have a decent support base in Scotland at all?
Well, I think where Reform are looking is to mop up those more centre-right people who are very disillusioned at the moment with the Conservatives. They feel very let down. They don't feel that they have a political home anymore. And I think, yes, Reform have an opportunity to appeal to people who feel politically homeless. And right now, there is a lot of people feeling that way.
And in terms of Humza Yousaf, who you alluded to earlier, do you think he's going to make some sort of speech or something to calm a lot of people, a lot of SNP supporters right now? Because I almost feel like he needs to sort of make some form of statement or some sort of public address so people can have some confidence in the party.
I think Humza Yousaf will go down the road of appealing to what he will call the wider yes movement. He will make comments like she will cooperate, she will tell them, she will do what she needs to do. He won't in any way, I think, diminish her and her standing. He will try to back her without implicating himself. But I think he will focus on this concept that actually the SNP is bigger than one person, that it's all about achieving independence in Scotland. He's already talking about making the general election a campaign for independence. So I think he will try to detract from what's going on by using that commentary and appealing to those people he considers independent supporters.
As a former party leader yourself, would you say that's the right tack? I mean, what would you do if you were in his position now?
Well, I'd hope to God I'd never be in a position that he's in, but there's usually a price to be paid for getting behind the wrong people. But I think, yes, I mean, he doesn't have a lot of choice at this point. I mean, the SNP's record in government is very poor. They have numerous failures on their list. And they will probably be doing everything they can. And he, as a leader, will have no choice but to go to the one thing that he thinks people rally behind. However, I think that is losing its gloss as well, as people are starting to realise that independence economically just doesn't add up. All the reports that the SNP themselves have commissioned and brought forward have actually said the same thing. So he's going to have a very difficult job to convince people that independence, other than being an emotionally appealing idea, is actually something you're going to put a cross in the box for and potentially put Scotland in really financial difficulty.
Well, Michelle, thank you very much. That's Michelle Ballantyne. She's the former leader of Reform UK in Scotland. Well, joining me live now, Martin Daubney and also Nigel Nelson. Martin, your thoughts on where do they go from now? Yeah,
I want to talk about the North Sea oil thing, because I think it's a really, really important thing. As I said, Alex Salmond, made a huge kind of drum roll of the fact that Scotland could be financially self-sufficient because of its North Sea oil. The black gold, the future is beneath our feet. And instead, we now have an entire political movement, not only the SNP, but also the Labour Party and the Tories. They're all Greta Thunbergs in disguise. And what's happened is we've turned off the tap. And Scotland, the United Kingdom, is just committing the most extravagant and grotesque act of economic self-harm by being tied to net zero zealotry. And the rest of the world's laughing at us. Norway makes £9 billion a year from North Sea oil, 300 miles to the north of Aberdeen, £0.2 billion in Britain, because we've sold it all off to foreign companies who are sucking the profit overseas, and meanwhile people onshore haven't got the jobs, they haven't got energy sovereignty. We rely on imports from the Middle East, we import coal from South Africa, from South America, from Australia. Selling coal to Newcastle used to be a cliche. Now we're doing it because we've lost our mind over net zero. We could be energy sovereign and wealthy. We could be a prosperous nation again, if only we weren't tied to this green madness.
But I mean, you mentioned Norway, but Norway are, they have a lot of, what's that word? They're self-sufficient in their own energy, so they make their own green fuels as well. So they are doing what we should already have, and then they are buying what they need.
And they have geothermic, they're blessed with that.
So they've got their own renewable energy.
They also have a nationalised energy sector. And look, I come from the old political left. I think if the Labour Party were clever, they would say, let's unlock this vast fortune and let's nationalise it.
Well,
and why wouldn't people want that?
I would have thought that would be... I mean, personally, I think nationalisation would be the way to do it when there's really no competition in terms of energy. So, for example, you can't choose your electricity provider. Maybe the supplier you can, but the actual person who actually gives you the electricity through the supplier, you can't really choose that. So things where there's no competition, it makes no sense to have it privatised. It should be, especially if it's a vital organ, so like water, electricity, gas, those things should be owned by the state, in my view.
I think that they should... Any public service or utility should belong to the public.
But that's why we're in this mess. Really.
Well, I mean, but Labour at the moment will only nationalise the railways. I mean, they've rode back on on other things like utilities and other services. I think that when it comes to the North Sea, going back to Martin's point there, that the question really is whether or not you believe in net zero. Martin doesn't think that we should be going in that direction.
I believe that people shouldn't be impoverished and they should have a choice rather than paying all their money on the utility bills at present. The quality of life has gone through. We're existing, we're not living, and that's because in large part net zero is hammering the poorest.
Well, what it should do is create plenty of jobs. I mean, the argument is that if we really went for net zero properly, which is why I'm a bit disappointed with Labour pulling back on the 28 billion, we would create somewhere in the region of 1 million jobs. So people would be better off.
Where are those jobs?
What would they be doing?
About what are they?
Those kind of jobs would be in onshore wind. So the idea would be to double that.
There's like 2 or 3 blokes maintaining turbines as opposed to hundreds underground digging coal. Where are the jobs?
And building them and all the supply chains that go along with them, that there are jobs there to be had. The question is whether you believe in the idea of net zero by 2050
well, China
and
doesn't.
Going for that.
India doesn't. They're laughing at us.
Well, India and China are much bigger countries, and what they would argue is even a small change does more for the environment than a big change in Britain.
Western governments expect our taxpayers to be stapled to the floor and have no quality of life for this mythical saving the planet, whereas the biggest polluters on Earth don't give a monkeys.
That might be hyperbole to actually say they'll be stapled to the floor, but the point there is, yes, it will cost. It will cost all of us to get there. It'll cost government, it'll cost us as individuals. The question then is, do you think the rewards are worth having at the end of the journey?
Well, what are those rewards? They're ephemeral. An ephemeral reward of what? Of saving the planet?
It's a pretty big reward if you can do that.
But look, we can also do the same by efficiently and in a modern manner extracting the gold beneath our feet. Things have moved on since the 1970s when my dad was down the pit. We can do this now in a much cleaner way. I think people would vote in their millions for cheaper energy and prosperity, not reliance on imports.
Well, that would be a good thing if we could only do that. That would be lovely. But unfortunately, right now, we do need to rely on foreign oil and gas, and we should, I think, obviously utilise what we have here as well. But what are your thoughts? Keep them coming. GBNews@gbnews.com. You're watching GB News. More to come in on this breaking story. But first, let's get your latest news headlines.
Good afternoon to you. It is 4 o'clock. Aaron Armstrong here in the GB newsroom. Well, as we've been hearing, Nicola Sturgeon's been arrested by police investigating SNP funding and finances. The former First Minister is in custody, being questioned by detectives. A spokesperson for the former SNP leader says she voluntarily attended an interview and has consistently said she'll cooperate with the investigation. In April, her husband, Peter Murrell, who was the SNP's chief executive, was arrested. He was released without charge pending further inquiries. Their home and the party headquarters were also searched, with police seen removing boxes of evidence. 3 British tourists are missing after a dive boat burst into flames in the Red Sea off Egypt. Officials say 12 Britons were rescued, along with 12 Egyptian crew and guides. It is believed the fire was caused by an electrical short circuit. The Foreign Office has confirmed it's in contact with Egyptian authorities and is assisting those involved. One of Boris Johnson's allies says the resignations of 2 Tory MPs was not a coordinated attempt to undermine the Prime Minister. Jacob Rees-Mogg insists there's no plot against Rishi Sunak and believes he should remain leader. He also believes Mr Johnson could easily get back into Parliament at the next election. The former Prime Minister announced he's stepping down as an MP after being handed the findings of the Partygate inquiry. Sir Jacob says there could be a split if some MPs try to block his return, but admits things could have been done better.
One always deserves blame for one's own mistakes. It would be absurd of me to pretend that Boris hasn't made mistakes. There was a man called Peter Wentworth who in the late 16th century was locked up in the Tower for saying in the House of Commons, "None is without fault, no, not our gracious Queen." The same could be said of Boris. None is without fault, no, not our gracious Boris. That is true of all of us.
Meanwhile, Leave campaigner Nigel Farage believes it's the end for Boris Johnson with the Conservatives, but the GB News presenter told Camilla Tominey he's been talking to Tory MPs about potentially joining a new party.
Conservatives are totally divided, completely chaotic and letting people down. When they've got the cost of living crisis, the crisis in the NHS, the Conservatives seem unable to give the lead that Britain needs.
Well, that was the Lib Dem leader, Ed Davey. Let's move on to Ukraine. It says its counter-offensive against Russia is underway. President Volodymyr Zelensky says he's optimistic about regaining lost territory. It's after Ukraine said its forces had advanced up to 2,000 metres along the front line near the eastern city of Bakhmut. Russia's disputing the claim. And the Met Office has warned almost a month's rain could fall over parts of the UK in the next 12 hours. And that is as temperatures continue to soar. 30 degrees recorded in Suffolk earlier. It could reach 32. Yellow thunderstorm alerts, though, which may come as a relief for many, have been issued for Scotland, Northern Ireland, England and Wales, parts of those countries anyway, and they will be in force until 9 o'clock tomorrow. And a volcano in Hawaii's Big Island that erupted early on Wednesday morning is still flaring. Some dramatic pictures from the west rim of that volcano. It's located in a closed national park. It is one of the world's most active volcanoes. The lava flows are expected to remain confined to the surrounding crater. This is GB News. More as it happens. But now, back to Nana.
Hello and welcome. This is GB News on TV, online and on digital radio. I'm Nana Akua. For the next 2 hours, me and my panel will be taking on some of the big topics hitting the headlines right now. We'll be covering the very latest story from Nicola Sturgeon's arrest. Joining me today, it's author and broadcaster Christine Hamilton, also broadcaster and journalist Danny Kelly. Stay tuned, we'll be discussing all of that. Just to bring you up to speed on the very latest, the former SNP leader And First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has been arrested by police investigating the party's finances. Nicola is the third senior SNP figure to be taken into custody after her husband Peter Murrell, the party's former chief executive, and Colin Beattie, the party's ex-treasurer. Investigation into the party's finances has been ongoing since July 2021, after the party treasurer Douglas Chapman MP resigned from the role. Now let's get some reaction from my panel. So let's have a chat with you, Christine Hamilton. A lot of people saying that the news isn't a surprise that she's actually been arrested. It was more the timing of the arrest. Are you surprised at all that Nicola's been taken into custody?
I'm not surprised, no. I mean, it was obviously going to happen. But, I mean, today of all days, just when you think politics can't get any more exciting with Boris and goodness knows what, which we were going to talk about, suddenly, bang! It's a Christmas coming all together. All Christmas is coming together for Starmer, isn't it? I mean, Boris defenestrated, Nicola Sturgeon being arrested. But I think we have to remember, I have been arrested. Neil and I have been arrested exactly by the Metropolitan Police. It does not mean that she is guilty. We have to bear that in mind, and we have to remember that and keep that at the forefront. It does not automatically mean she is innocent unless she is proven guilty. And it's part of the process. They kind of had to arrest her. They were going to arrest her. But I am surprised it's now. I mean, why do it on a Sunday afternoon? Perhaps they thought that England was getting too much attention with Boris and Nadine and goodness knows what, so let's drop a bombshell up north of the border. But no, it's not a surprise, but I am very surprised that it's happened now.
And just to reiterate, a spokesperson for Nicola Sturgeon said the former SNP leader voluntarily attended an interview with Police Scotland and that she would cooperate with the investigation. Danny?
Like Christine, I too have been arrested.
Have you?
And released without charge. What did you do? It's a really funny story. I was the lookalike. I was the doppelganger of somebody who stole petrol.
There can't be somebody that looks like you, Danny.
Honestly, it was the spitterman. I was the doppelganger of someone who stole petrol. They cloned some reg numbers from a garage that I used to work at. And when I got sacked from the garage, I mean, it does all of this circumstantial evidence is pointing to me actually being the thing. Anyway, the old Bill came round and knocked. I remember it was a sunny Saturday, and I was in the garden with my dad. This was about 25 years ago, having a cup of tea. And then 6 hours later, my dad said, "Where's Daniel gone?" Because they actually ferried me off to Stratford-upon-Avon police station, and they showed me a photograph of the guy.
Father, or
I didn't tell my dad. He was in the garden drinking a cup of tea, wondering when I was going to come back.
You didn't tell him that you'd been arrested?
No, I didn't, because I was just so confused. I was confused and hugely embarrassed. And they took me to Stratford-upon-Avon police station. They showed me the photograph, the still from the CCTV, and I thought, oh my God, that does look like me. But then I said, where's the petrol station? And I've never been to that petrol station, but they didn't believe me. I tell you why they didn't believe me, because they more or less said this.
How much of you did they see? Just the head? Or
it was the whole thing, and I thought, that does look like me. So what they did, they went to the garage that I'd just been fired from because the registration plate was from a car that was sitting on the forecourt, and they said, that's Danny Kelly, we've just sacked him. Not for any nefarious reasons, just because I used to get bored working for people. I used to be a scallywag, nothing bad. And so they said, look, you're a Scouser. You think you're a big shot here in a little town of Warwick and all of that. I said, that is not me, officer. And I had to plead with them to actually drive me back to Warwick. Because they said, make your own way back to Warwick.
So they accepted it wasn't you?
They accepted it wasn't me, but because they'd made an error, they'd got the hump, and they, at first, refused to drive me back to Warwick. So just to reiterate Christine's point, people do get nicked all the time and then get released without further investigation.
Yeah. What are the chances of that? Both your panellists have been arrested.
Well, I can safely say I've never been arrested, so there. Well,
not yet.
Thank you, Christine. I don't think I'm very good, but joining me now...
Danny and I, hang on.
OK, our deputy political editor, Tom Harwood. Crikey, Tom, I don't know why I brought these two, but Tom, so get us up to date then, up to speed with what's been happening with regard to Nicola Sturgeon and her arrest.
Well, there's been an investigation into SNP party finances and possible fraud within them since 2021. That's when Police Scotland launched what's known as Operation Branchform. It's so far led to 3 arrests, not just Nicola Sturgeon today, but of course her husband, Peter Murrell, at the start of April, and also the former treasurer of the party as well. So those 3 arrests have taken place, 2 of them in April and 2 released released without charge, but also, of course, at the same time, there have been quite rigorous searches of the party HQ and of Nicola Sturgeon and Peter Morell's private home as well. So some big questions in what has been quite a lengthy investigation, which doesn't really show any signs of slowing down as things stand. What we have seen in the last few minutes or so is responses from both the Scottish Labour Party and the Scottish Conservative Party. The Scottish Labour Party, for their part, are saying Humza Yousaf must urgently come clean about what he knew. The current First Minister, of course, has been seen as very close to Nicola Sturgeon. Many people cast him as the continuity candidate in the leadership election that took place upon her resignation. How much did he know? How close was he to the events? That's what the Scottish Labour Party want to know, whereas the Scottish Conservative Party have said Humza Yousaf must now show some leadership and suspend Nicola Sturgeon's membership of the SNP. So the Scottish Tories calling for Humza Yousaf to suspend Nicola Sturgeon as a member of the SNP following her arrest earlier this afternoon. That's just a flavour of reaction north of the border from the political parties. But of course, we will see potentially some knock-on reaction from the people of Scotland in what many people expect is a rapidly approaching by-election in the seat of Margaret Ferrier, the MP, the SNP elected MP, now independent, who was found to have broken all of those COVID rules, taking that test, meant to isolate, but instead travelling hundreds of miles on public transport across the country. She received a 30-day suspension from the House of Commons in the last couple of weeks, and that triggers, of course, a recall petition, and it could well be that her constituents in Scotland get to have their say on the whole mess of Scottish politics and indeed the mess within the SNP.
Seems like there's a mess all over the political spectrum right now. Thank you very much. That's Deputy Political Editor Tom Harwood with an update. Well, joining me now is former Labour Minister for Europe, Denis McShane. Denis McShane, welcome. Thank you very much for joining me. Unsurprising news to most. But what do you think this signals now with regard to the SNP?
Well, it's extraordinary. Let me just add to Danny and Christine, I too have been arrested in Britain by the communist police in Poland, put in prison, by the apartheid police in South Africa. So, Nana, you're the only innocent person, I think, on the show today.
Well, to be fair, though, if you're arrested, but to be fair, Denis, if you're arrested, doesn't mean you're guilty, though. Just to be fair.
I was guilty of everything. I mean, my flabber is completely ghasted. It's flabbergasting. I mean, yesterday, Friday, we're living with the collapse, the disappearance of Boris Johnson, and now Nicola Sturgeon joins him in the dustbin of history. She's been detained by the police. Of course, she's innocent till there's a trial or anything, but it's the end, and it's a huge blow to the SNP. And the problem is you've got these two great populist nationalist parties, the SNP, populist nationalists, saying everything that's a problem in Scotland is a fault of England. And you've got Boris Johnson for the last 15 years making the claim everything that's a problem in Britain is a fault of Europe. So let's get out of Europe. Let's have a nationalist, populist, English-only Tory party and all be well. It's a doppelganger, the double image of Nicola Sturgeon. And boy, oh boy, I mean, these are huge, massive political developments.
Really? I mean, wow. And obviously, the different response from the different parties. So you've got, as Tom pointed out, the Labour Party saying that Humza Yousaf must come clean, say what he knew. And then you've got the Conservatives saying, show some leadership and suspend Nicola Sturgeon. Why do you think they have such differing approaches?
Well, right now, I imagine all Labour wants. I mean, you were calling him Humza Useless non-stop a few weeks ago. Now, I well remember, I love the nickname. I saw him on the BBC with Laura Kunsberg this morning, and he was useless. And I think he'll be blown out of the water by this. There was a Scottish Daily Express poll a few days ago showing Labour winning 31 seats in Scotland. Now, I think, like all those polls, that's an exaggeration. But the plain fact is that the glory days of the SNP are coming to an end. They're not going to go away. Scotland doesn't want to be controlled by parties based in London, that's for sure. But the idea that breaking Britain apart, putting borders and passport checks at Gretna Green between Scotland and England isn't going to work. I think the Rutherglen, I was born in Rutherglen, I know Rutherglen, I've got family in Rutherglen, and this is the constituency which now will have a recall petition, and I expect the SNP may well lose that seat. I mean, it's just accelerating beyond belief. We are actually an international laughing stock at the moment with all the things that's been happening in the last decade coming to this huge crunch moment.
I know, it does feel like that, doesn't it? Dennis McShane, thank you very much. Always good to talk to you. If you just joined us, welcome on board. This is GB News. We are the People's Channel. It's coming up to 15 minutes after 4 o'clock. I'm Nana Akua. And joining me to discuss this, let's get some reaction on Sturgeon's arrest from my panel, author and broadcaster Christine Hamilton and journalist and broadcaster Danny Kelly. Danny, I want to come to you first. He made some references to Margaret Ferrier. Do you remember her?
Yeah.
She's the one that she was having a test. She had the COVID test. She was supposed to isolate.
I remember.
She went off to church and I don't know. She did
got on the
something else.
train.
Then she got on a train. Then when she found that she had COVID, got back on a train.
Yeah.
You don't want to laugh because
COVID
it's not
Express.
funny. COVID Express.
One thing, a lot of people are saying that Nicola Sturgeon should be suspended. I think that undermines one of the greatest tenets in UK life, is that the presumption of innocence until found guilty. Now, if you are suspended because you've been arrested, then there's almost an assumption that maybe you're guilty. And that actually... This is just a personal view. When Boris Johnson was under investigation for having parties, you know, all of the Labour wallers were saying, suspend him, suspend him, suspend him. Now, in the end, he got a 50 quid fine, so he's found guilty of one misdemeanour, if you like. But I think she shouldn't be suspended because it takes us back to our conversations where Christine's been arrested without foundation, or proven without foundation. Myself have been arrested without foundation. But if I was suspended from, say, GBNews whilst this police investigation was to go on, then that I would feel most harshly treated because I'm innocent. And potentially GBNews should say, well, let's find out if he's innocent. Suspend him if he gets found guilty.
But there's lots of professions where that would happen. So, for example...
Well, I think that's unfair.
For example, if you were in the police force and you were suspended, they were investigating something, you'd be suspended.
Well, that's the police force.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that there are other situations, other employers that would do that.
Well, indeed, and I mean, the House of Commons is pretty quick to suspend people when there are allegations. Usually, at the moment, seems to be of sexual impropriety. They are told to stay away from the Commons until it's organised, which, as you say, implies that they've been assumed to be guilty. Personally, I can't ever see any future for Scottish independence. I really don't think that there is an appetite for it. Obviously, things can change over the decades, over 5 years, 10 years. But to me, her dream is over. And the idea that Scotland can rejoin the EU is just ridiculous. How can a little tiny, not an island, a little tiny part of a country that's left the EU decide to rejoin? Why would they, if they want to be independent of Britain and all the shackles that they say that Westminster imposes, why would they want to shackle themselves to Brussels? It's a nonsensical argument, the independence argument, and they can't afford to be independent of England. And I think the majority in Scotland will grow for no independence. So I think it's finished anyway. And
do you think a lot of young people might want to be joining back with the Europeans?
Well, if they've got any sense, surely. I mean, what is it? You're a socialist. If you're not a socialist when you're 20, you've got no heart, and if you're not a Tory when you're 30, you've got no head. And I think the same is possibly slightly true about independence. But I don't think Hamza Yousaf will last very long. And, I mean, they missed their opportunity by not having, what was that lady
Kate Forbes.
Kate Forbes, because she had an unacceptable view because of her religion. She was against abortion, I think.
But I'm not sure. I mean, I think Hamza avoided that vote, though. Didn't he avoid the votes? There was the same-sex marriage vote, which he avoided by doing something else, so he didn't have to make the vote. So I think his vote might have been the same.
We're going to find out.
Politician does that?
Maybe at the end of the day, whether Nicola Sturgeon is going to be charged. And if she's charged, then that is a significant step. Going back to Christine's point about an appetite for independence, I don't think that we can conflate today's arrest with the health of the SNP, because the SNP...
Why not?
Well, because I don't think, even if she is charged and convicted, I don't think that's going to prevent people saying, I still want to be independent from England. And from Wales, that's not going to make people think, do you know what, actually, let's stick with the Brits. Or England, sorry, because they are Brits.
And a couple of commentators, like David Maddox from The Express, he pointed that out earlier, that there is still an appetite for independence.
Very much so.
But this must diminish some who are sort of going along with the bandwagon of it, because, you know... But let's... I'm going to have a chat with... Because joining me now is a former Sky political correspondent, Peter Spencer. Peter, thank you very much for joining me. Oh, Peter, this is big news, although a lot of people are saying they're not surprised, but it's the timing that has been the main thing here. What's your take on it?
It was always seemed rather odd the way Nicola Sturgeon butted out of leading the SNP anyway without giving any sort of particularly convincing reason. Now, I do take the point that everyone's made the innocent till proved guilty, and remember that she has agreed to do this. This arrest is by agreement, and her husband and the former treasurer were both released without charge. This could well be the case for her as well. But it has to be said, in my judgment, this is a huge nail in the coffin, or perhaps one more nail in the coffin of the credibility both of the SNP and of independents. Remember, she was the standard bearer. She was the golden girl. She was the Nicola Queen of Scots, if you like. And she had a huge rating, just the same as Boris Johnson, it has to be said, because of the magnetism of her personality. Her successor, Mr. Yousaf, hasn't got anything like the same poll rating or indeed credibility, I would argue. That's one point. So I note also that the polls, in fact, show a majority for not leaving the United Kingdom. Let me get it right now. So that's one point. The second point is, of course, remember that Scotland until 2015 was Labour heartlands, and then they went down from dozens of MPs north of the border to just the one. And they, of course, are watching this whole situation with extreme care and I imagine a certain amount of glee, for heaven's sake, because obviously the UK general election will be probably at some point in the latter part of next year, and they are hoping to retrieve a great deal, to claw back a great many of the seats that they lost. Because I think that this whole saga does dig a hole in the hegemony of the Scot Nats.
Well, of course, it was probably the failure of the Labour Party in Scotland which gave the SNP the foothold to begin with. So if they can reassert themselves there, then that's really, again, one of the reasons why they lost ground as well. These extra votes they could potentially, and extra seats they could potentially get, could be the difference for going forward in this election. They may not need to require a coalition of any kind, which would be useful for them. What do you think that Keir Starmer is thinking as he's watching this then? He must be rubbing his hands with glee.
Well, exactly. Of course he is. And he's also buoyed by an MRP poll last week, which was the first big one related to the constituency boundaries, which, of course, will be different from how they were at the last election. And that suggested, and it was a big poll, that suggested that actually he is on course for a landslide that's even bigger than that achieved by Tony Blair in 1997. And, you know, it was sort of on the basis of following the narrative that the voters are actually, whether or not they love Keir Starmer, the fact is they're fed up with the Tory bequest of crumbling public services and a cost of living crisis. And so there is that sense, let's give the other lot a go.
Well, I mean, frankly, there doesn't seem to be another credible or slightly credible alternative, or one that's a realistic proposition. So there are no other parties. Do you think that's a fault of our electoral system, that we're stuck with two parties, and if one is doing such a bad job, we literally have no other option, and the others simply have no chance of any prospect of getting elected?
Well, I mean, of course, it is that is the consequence of our rather clumsy first past the post system, which does, I mean, and it's sort of, the two main parties love it because it effectively does rub out all the others. But you may remember that when there was the Cameron-Clegg axis, they did have a referendum say, listen, what about getting rid of our antiquated, clunky old voting system and bring in proportional representation? And the electorate voted against the idea. I suspect the electorate voted with an almighty sort of yawn at the same time, those of who bothered to turn up at all. So we are stuck with that situation, and it is a subject of ongoing absolute frustration, particularly to the Liberal Democrats of the third party.
Well, they constantly say that they want that sort of proportional representation until they get into power, and then they think, actually, now I'm in, it's better for me to keep it the way it is because I benefit better. Thank you very much, Peter Spencer. Lovely to talk to you. He's the former Sky political correspondent. Stay tuned. This is GB News. We are the People's Channel. I'm Nana Akua. Now let's get some reaction. If you've just tuned in, Nicola Sturgeon has been arrested. Joining me, author and broadcaster Christine Hamilton, and also UKIP leader Neil Hamilton. Neil, thank you very much for joining me.
Very good to be here, especially with your other guest.
I know, your wife, Christine. Now, talk to me about this. Does this come as any surprise to you that Nicola Sturgeon's been arrested?
No, I think it was inevitable. After all, her husband is at the centre of this scandal. We don't know what's true and what isn't as yet. The reason why she's been arrested is that in order for whatever she says to the police to be admissible as evidence in court, if there are court proceedings in due course, she has to give that evidence under arrest and with all the protections of being warned about the consequences of what she says and so on. So it doesn't indicate that she personally is culpable. As Danny and Christine said earlier on, after we've all been arrested, because I've been arrested as well.
I'm in the mind, I have not been arrested.
You should always leave room in life for new challenges, I think.
So. Not that one,
but so in our case, there was absolutely no truth in the allegations against us whatsoever, and pure invention. But we had to be arrested so that in our statements to the police, those could be used in evidence in court if there were subsequently court proceedings, which there were not.
And that must have been quite bad, though, the fact that obviously people get arrested, but then they're then found guilty. The impact that would have on you and Christine personally, that must have been quite tough.
Of course, it was devastating, and we were self-employed, working in the media at the time. So, of course, all our work would have disappeared overnight as a result of the wall-to-wall bad publicity that we received as a result of that. However, we were able to knock it out of court pretty quickly, within a few weeks. The police announced that no further proceedings were going to be taken. But there are a lot of people who spend sometimes years with this sword of Damocles hanging over their heads, and it is most unfair. And we were talking before the break about the principle of innocent unless proven guilty, and therefore the calls to suspend Nicola Sturgeon as member of the SNP and so on. It would be unfair in a way and prejudicial if that were to happen, although this frequently does happen in political life and in business life as well, where people are suspended from work until the outcome of proceedings. So, there is a conflict there, I think, between this basic principle of justice on the one hand, and of course the interests of public perception has on, in a case of a business, is that going to affect its bottom line and everybody else working for the business? And in politics, what's the implication of this for the fortunes of the political party of which you're a member? And the other political parties are now making hay with this so far as they can without risk of libel in what they say about Nicola Sturgeon. So it's it all adds to the gaiety of nations, I suppose.
Well, you're a party leader of UKIP party. If you were in Humza Yousaf's position, it's so difficult not to say useless, but it's Yousaf. This just rolls off the tongue. If you were in Humza Yousaf's position right now, what would your next move be in order to sort of keep your party together and keep the kind of energy positive?
Well, I think what he's doing is absolutely right at the moment. He's not taking any further action against Nicola Sturgeon, and he's stating the plain fact of the matter that this is a police investigation. He's not going to do anything to prejudice it, and nobody should draw any conclusions in advance of charges being brought and the effects of any subsequent trial on the defendants in that trial. So, we are at the minute in a kind of fog of uncertainty about what's going on. It all looks very murky, but who knows who did what or whether anything was done which is morally culpable or illegal.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. And a spokesperson for Nicola Sturgeon has said that the former SNP leader voluntarily attended an interview with Police Scotland and that she would cooperate with the investigation. So she's doing what she should be doing, right, Christine?
It could all turn out to be a complete damp squib, the whole thing. Nicola Sturgeon might turn out to be completely innocent. Peter Murrell and whoever the third person is, it might all have been an absolute storm in a teacup. We just don't know yet. And goodness knows how long before we find out.
I mean, I expect that Boris will want to be arrested now just to keep in the news.
Well, there's Trump as well. I mean, do you not feel does it feel like there's a sense that all these charismatic, wonderful leaders who are so good at drawing a crowd have suddenly attracted this weird kind of energy where they're all being arrested?
It is almost like a novel, isn't it? When you've got the two great charismatic blondes on both sides of the I nearly said the ocean, and you've got Trump, and then he's got Biden, who is about the least charismatic, most boring imaginable president. And we've got Boris has got Rishi Sunak, who is, frankly, not charismatic, whatever the reverse of not charismatic is. So it is extraordinary that these two, and they happen both to be blonde, these two blonde bombshells have exploded in, I think, the very same week, the arresting of Trump, the charging of Trump, and Boris resigning, etc. Fine, we're not talking about Boris, we're talking about Nicola. We may talk about Boris.
We're going to talk about Boris as well.
But I mean, it is quite extraordinary that the coming together of these two seismic events, frankly, both of them seismic in their own right, and for them to be happening at the same time is historic.
It is really, isn't it? And obviously
momentous.
It is
exciting times.
It is exciting times. A big time in politics right now. I mean, stay tuned. Give us your thoughts, by the way. gbviews@gbnews.com or tweet us at GBNews. This is GBNews. We are the People's Channel. We've got loads more still to come. And what do you think that the rest of the world is thinking? Because, I think that this country... I love this country. I love the United Kingdom. I think it's a fantastic place to be.
Yeah.
But it seems to be kind of imploding. All the different elements of it. You've got someone who won't meet. You've got... Nicola Sturgeon, who's now being arrested, although she may well be innocent, as we know. Boris Johnson and the Privilege Committee going on, and the kangaroo court that he calls it. And it just feels like a level of instability at the moment, that we're going through something.
Well, I suppose every country goes through periods like this. We've had them in this country before. I've been in politics a very long time. I first stood for Parliament in February 1974, decades before you were born. And
very nice of you, but I was actually here.
He's good, isn't he? The 1979 election took place in the winter of discontent, or immediately after the winter of discontent, so-called, when nothing worked in the country, the dead went unburied and rubbish piled up in the streets. And we've had other periods of political instability under Thatcher, etc. as well. So I don't think this is anything new.
He doesn't think it's anything new. Wow. Well, I've got to say, it's one of the most tumultuous periods in politics I've ever seen over the last few years. And it all started, I think, was it Partygate or was it before that? Well, listen, stay tuned.
Piece of cake.
Piece of cake. Piece of cake. It's a piece of cake.
And a suitcase full of booze, don't forget.
Well, no, he didn't take the booze. He didn't carry the booze. I don't know. This is just stay with us. We'll keep you updated on everything that's going on here at GB News. But first, let's get your latest news headlines.
Hi there, it is 4:32. Aaron Armstrong here in the GB newsroom. Well, as we've been hearing, Nicola Sturgeon's been arrested by police investigating SNP finances and funding. The former First Minister's in custody. She's being questioned by detectives. A spokesperson for the former SNP leader says she voluntarily attended an interview and has consistently said she'll cooperate with the investigation. In April, her husband, Peter Murrell, who was the Scottish National Party's chief executive, he was arrested and released without charge pending further inquiries. Their home and the party headquarters were also searched. Police were seen digging in the front garden and also removing boxes of evidence. 3 British tourists are missing after a dive boat burst into flames in the Red Sea off Egypt. Officials say 12 Britons were rescued, along with the 12 Egyptian crew and guides. The Foreign Office has confirmed it's in contact with Egyptian authorities and is continuing to assist those involved in the incident. One of Boris Johnson's allies says the recent resignations of 2 Tory MPs was not a coordinated attempt to undermine the Prime Minister. Jacob Rees-Mogg insists there's no plot against Rishi Sunak and believes he should remain leader. He also suggested, though, Mr Johnson could return to Westminster, saying he could easily get back into Parliament at the next election.
One always deserves blame for one's own mistakes. It would be absurd of me to pretend that Boris hasn't made mistakes There was a man called Peter Wentworth who in the late 16th century was locked up in the Tower for saying in the House of Commons, "None is without fault, no, not our gracious Queen." The same could be said of Boris. None is without fault, no, not our gracious Boris. That is true of all of us.
And the Met Office has warned that almost a month's rain could fall over parts of the UK in the next 12 hours. That is as temperatures continue to climb. 30 degrees recorded in Suffolk earlier, and it could reach 32 in some parts of the UK. Yellow thunderstorm alerts have been issued and they'll be enforced until 9 p.m. tomorrow. More on all of our stories on our website, gbnews.com. Now, back to Nana.
Good afternoon. This is GB News on TV, online and on digital radio. It's fast approaching 35 minutes after 4 o'clock. I'm Nana Akua. And if you've just tuned in, if you literally just put on your radio, you'll want to hear this, that Nicola Sturgeon has actually been arrested, but she has not been charged. There's no sense that she's done anything illegal. She actually put herself forward for that to happen, and she's being questioned as we speak. Let's continue with our coverage of former SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon and her arrest. Joining me now is GB News presenter Nigel Farage. Nigel, thank you very much for joining me. Well, it's sudden news, but most are saying it's not surprising at all. What do you take from this?
Well, what a few days of midsummer madness. We've got Johnson, Trump, and now Sturgeon. I mean, the whole thing is quite extraordinary. Look, I thought, from the start of this that our husband, Peter Murrell, was probably in very real trouble. If you raise money, political money, for a very specific purpose, which they did, about 600 grand, to fight a referendum, and then spend the money on something else, you may have a problem. There is also the question of the camper van. So whether Nicola Sturgeon is being brought in, being asked to give a witness statement about what her husband did, or whether she's a suspect, it's a little bit too early to say. Either way, I think what you're seeing is nemesis following hubris in very, very short order, because she was riding high, absolutely the queen of the castle, bringing in her completely balmy trans legislation, not worrying about resignations. It was as if she'd reached that position of power where she didn't need to worry, and how quickly things have changed.
Well, Keir Starmer must be looking on this moment and thinking that this is his time, because it does seem as though everything is just coming together for him, and he's pretty much done very little for it. And a lot of the things he's put forward, he's rowing back on.
Yeah, look, Scotland, it's not long ago when the Labour Party were guaranteed 40 seats in Scotland, and they've gone from 40 down to 1. And it's hard to think they haven't got a prospect of getting between 20 and 30 seats at the next election. And that changes the whole arithmetic. This idea that maybe Labour would need coalition partners with the Lib Dems or whoever else it may be, I don't see it. I think all of this leads us directly towards a big Labour majority.
It does feel that way, doesn't it? The Conservatives are saying that actually the party, the SNP, should show some leadership and suspend Nicola Sturgeon, whereas the Labour Party is saying Humza must come clean about what he knew. If you've been a party leader before, what would you be doing if you were in Humza Yousaf's shoes right now?
Well, I would find out, she's currently in custody. I would find out immediately she was released, whether she was there simply as a witness to what her husband had done, or whether she's being held as a suspect. And if she is a suspect, then Yousaf has no choice, like you, to do the right thing and suspend her.
It would seem, well, obviously, as I said, a spokesperson for Nicola Sturgeon said that the former SNP leader voluntarily attended an interview with Police Scotland and that she would cooperate with the investigation. It just feels like there is a moment in politics, as you said, like a summer kind of madness where all these big leaders and all these big charismatic figures are falling. And Humza Yousaf, really, looking at it, I don't think he can cut it. Do you think this is pretty much the end for the SNP?
Yeah, I think they had this meteoric rise, most extraordinary rise, and that had as much to do with the absolute weakness of the Labour and Conservative. Labour mired in corruption scandals north of the border for many, many years. The Tories completely disconnected from people north of the border. So into that vacuum came the SNP. But I think, well, number one, I don't see any prospect of Scotland leaving the United Kingdom. I'm pleased about it. Many of my friends are very cheesed off because they say ditch the Scots and cut 4p off income tax. But I think the union should be maintained. And look, the SNP won't lose all their support. You know, there is a momentum for separation from the United Kingdom. They will still, whatever happens, they will still come back at the next election with a reasonable, maybe even considerable number of MPs. But as for them being in a position to push a second referendum, that now is for the birds.
And with regard, obviously, for Keir Starmer, he's the beneficiary of a lot of this, because I don't see any other parties that really are in a position, or that the Scottish people will vote for. They certainly won't be voting for the Tory party. Most people are probably not voting for the Tory party, even Conservative supporters themselves. Or do you think that, with regard to some of the policies that the Labour Party are rowing back on, Keir Starmer has come up with his, he's come up with this no more drilling of North Sea oil and gas. Do you think that he's now going to have to roll back again on yet another one of his ideas?
I was surprised by some of this. I thought he'd do a Blair and just say that let's not frighten the horses economically at all. Clearly, that North Sea ban on drilling was meant to be red meat to the left of the party. Let's pacify the left. Let's show ahead of the election that we're united as a party. There are no disparate voices, unlike the Tories, who are permanently in civil war. You're right, he is rowing back. But actually, this is about more than just Keir Starmer. This is the whole net zero agenda is beginning to unravel as people realise it's going to cost an absolute fortune and globally make no difference at all. So yes, it causes Starmer a problem, but equally, it causes the Tory government a problem too, because they're the ones in government that have put much of this in place. And I mean, if anyone thinks there will be no more manufacture of internal combustion engines after 2030, forget it, there will be.
Of course. I mean, it seems a ludicrous policy and most people will be rowing back on that one. Well, listen, Nigel, also joining me live is Martin Daubney. And I know Martin has a question for you as well, Martin.
Yeah, hello, boss. I just want to ask you, one of the illusions that the SNP also sell to the electorate is the prospect of rejoining the European Union. That also now must be an absolute tatters.
Well, the whole policy was crazy. I mean, how they were allowed in 2014 to call it an independence referendum, but all they wanted to do was substitute Westminster for Brussels. I could never, ever get my head around that. I guess it was the sheer laziness and capture of much of that Edinburgh-based Scottish media. Look, rejoining the EU as an out-there policy doesn't work. The danger, though, Martin, is that the Tories have made clear under Starmer that, number one, they don't want to get rid of any more EU rules. So we're so at the moment, we're so convergent with EU rules that it makes the Labour government very easy to sign up once again to the single market. And then we say, well, we're taking their rules, but having no say. Maybe we'll have an associate membership. And then years on from that, maybe we'll go to membership. So there is a possibility that the Brexit fight may, I hope not, but it may happen again.
Well, we'll see. Well, stay with us, though, because Nigel... I've also got the other Nigel here, Nigel Nelson. Nigel Nelson, I know you want to pose a question to Nigel.
Yeah, Nigel, would you think that things have changed since the 2014 referendum, which means that the Scots, should they want independence, do have a right to another referendum?
Once in a generation, Nigel, is once in a generation. We're not even a decade on from that. And it's funny, isn't it? I mean, Sturgeon, of course, opposed the result of a Scottish referendum and the result of a national referendum. No democratic referendum ever seemed to please her. No. Look, if you're going to have these big constitutional referendums, and it's right that we have them, I would have thought a generation should be defined as about 25 years, not a decade.
Yeah, Nigel, I want to ask you as well about this issue of North to Oil. I mean, it's totemic. It was to Alex Salmond's economic model for independence, self-sufficiency through black gold. And yet here we are, the SNP committing economic self-harm by going down the net zero route, echoed by the Labour Party. But surely Scottish voters would welcome the prospect of prosperity, of cheaper energy, of cutting their ties from this green madness that's bankrupting ordinary people.
Yeah, I mean, Salmond had an argument here. All the oil's ours, we'll take the revenue, and that means we can be free and independent and self-funding. Now, there were all sorts of problems here, such as foreign companies that had invested, such as actually the fact that the English border went in that direction up the North Sea and not in that direction. But at least it was an economic argument for standing alone. Now, when it came the next stage of joining the euro, he got into trouble. Sturgeon ditched all of that for her alliance with the Scottish Greens and somehow told the world that wind power was going to make Scotland a prosperous country. And I think the Scots have done so. Actually, do you know what? There are about 200,000 jobs in Scotland reliant directly or indirectly on the North Sea Scottish oil and gas business. And you work that out, a population of 5 million people, is it any wonder that the SNP are in the mess they're in?
Well, I mean, it's a huge thing, really, this particular moment, actually, in politics, with the whole issue of all these different things happening. Everyone's talking about a landslide Labour victory now, especially with this. This is probably the final nail in the Conservatives' coffin, even if they had some sort of opportunity. I think they're right. I think that's the end of it. And do you see a future for the Tory party now as well, looking at the situation that we find ourselves in now?
The last couple of weeks, we've been living in fantasy land with much of the Tory supporting media saying, oh, there's still a chance. There's still a 30% chance the Conservatives can win a majority at the next election. Forget it. It's gone. It's done. It's over. Trust has been broken. The Red Wall voters have already legally divorced themselves from the Conservative Party. Many will stay at home. Some will go back to Labour. And in the southern part of the country, all I get from people is, Nigel, I can't bring myself to vote for them. And there any argument the Tories have got. And I had John Redwood on my show the other evening. So, John, why should I vote Conservative? Oh, because the others are worse. I'm sorry. I'm bored with all of that. I don't think there's ever been a moment, literally, not in my lifetime, when Westminster was more disconnected from the aspirations and fears of ordinary people than it is now. And 10 years ago, you know, I led the UKIP insurgency from nothing to 4 million votes and then on to the Brexit Party at over 5 million votes. And I do believe that we're beginning to move into the situation where an insurgency will come again. Such is the level of dissatisfaction in the country. And this one could be a lot bigger than last time.
Well, I've got to ask you, finally, really, about whether you see, because obviously with all the news of Boris Johnson, I couldn't let you go without asking whether you see Boris Johnson potentially restarting a new party and maybe joining with you. Is that likely?
Well, I think Boris is finished in the Conservative Party. I think to trigger a by-election without facing the music, without arguing his corner in Parliament, and effectively gifting Uxbridge to the Labour Party, and then followed by a couple of mates, and who knows whether they'll stay Conservative or go Lib Dem or whatever. I mean, when you do that much damage, when you shoot your own side in the back, you may have your own fanatical following of supporters, but the truth is the party will turn against him. You know, already there are Tory MPs calling it mutiny. Boris Johnson has run out of road with the Conservative Party, and the more he tries to foment civil war, the more they will loathe him and never allow him to stand again. So, if he wants to have a future in politics, it's got to be outside the Conservative Party, and that would be an attempt to completely reshape British politics. And he can try and set his own party up if he wants to, but I can promise you it's a very hard thing to do. I've done it more than once. And reform is there. It exists. It's got 6-7% of the polls. It's got a national structure. And it would be for Boris to get involved with that. And I have my huge disagreements with Boris on many, many issues. The net zero agenda, his relaxed attitude towards vast millions coming to the country every decade. But on the real big issue, the biggest constitutional issue of our lifetime, namely Brexit, I'm on the same side as him. And if it comes to a battle for him to save his legacy, then if he wants to go on in politics, he's going to have to find solutions outside the Tory party. And I would say reform is really the best possibility.
Well, right. Thank you so much for that, Nigel. That's Nigel Farage. He's a GBNews presenter. Thank you so much. This is GBNews. If you just joined us, welcome on board. It's coming up to 49 minutes after 4 o'clock. I'm Nana Akua. Joining me now is political commentator Nigel Nelson and also Martin Daubney.
Yeah.
Well, that was something, wasn't it, really? I mean, it's interesting that we end with Nigel saying that potentially, Boris could, if he wanted to, unite with reform. But then there's all the stuff with Nicola Sturgeon. It really is a melting pot of things happening in the political sphere at the moment.
First of all, that was an excellent interview with Nigel. And I think there are going to be a great many people out there in GB News land watching that, slavering at the prospect of a unifying moment, potentially, with people like Boris and Nigel Farage, a new actual Conservative Party, not a net zero Conservative Party, not an open borders Conservative Party, not the highest taxes since World War II Conservative Party, but an actual patriotic party that stands up for the working classes, for the small businesses, for the individual who wants a better quality of life. Now, at the moment, this is kite flying. Of course it is. But what a prospect that would be. A meteoric return, not with the Tories, but the forest fire of the next general election, and then the green shoots of something new. That's exciting.
Another party, Nigel, do you see it?
Well, I don't, because I think Nigel is absolutely right where he says that it's very difficult for small parties to break through under the first-past-the-post system. I think what Boris Johnson has done is he doesn't have a strategy, but he has a few tactics. And so he had very few options on Friday morning and a lot more by Friday evening by resigning, because he got rid of Uxbridge, which he would never have won, and he could do it on a matter of principle. It seems to me that all of us this afternoon are talking ourselves towards a general election, that whatever happens to the Conservative Party, and I'm thinking in terms of the Conservative Party and other parties, they've got to find out what they stand for, what they are. That argument should be in opposition.
Well, let's see what political commentator Claire Pissell has to say about all of that, because she joins us live now. Claire, big news, Nicola Sturgeon. She has been arrested. There is no sign that she's guilty of anything, and she has not been charged with anything at all. What is your take on what's happening?
Well, this has been an enormous week for politics. I don't think I've seen quite so much being stuffed into 1 week for an incredibly long time. And I think this is a really interesting development with the SNP, but it leads us into a bigger question of trust in politics as a whole. Why are people so switched off from politics? Well, I think it's largely with the behaviour that we've seen in the Conservative Party, especially over the last few days, and now what's happening in Scotland with the SNP. And people are just not trusting those politicians to either tell the truth or to behave in a certain way.
It does feel that way. I mean, the SNP, though, itself is just literally imploding, because obviously Nicola Sturgeon, she left suddenly. I thought it was a bit of a sudden departure. And then, of course, all this stuff with her husband. And then, of course, we've had Humza Yousaf there in charge. Do you think that the SNP are pretty much dead in the water?
I think this is a massive blow to the SNP, and I can't see how they're going to get out of this with their reputation intact. I really can't. I think Humza Yousaf is doing all he can at the moment by keeping quiet, remembering that there is a police investigation ongoing. So he's doing quite the right thing. But until we understand what Nicola Sturgeon is being accused of or not accused of, I think we have to be very, very careful. But I think the SNP have really burnt all of their bridges with the people of Scotland. They haven't delivered on independence, which was their one great policy, and they seem to have made a mess of every other part of the administration within Scotland, whether it be transport, whether it be education, or whether it be health. So you would look to the next election, and especially interesting is the by-election, the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election that could be upcoming. I think that will give you a flavour of what the people of Scotland are thinking, and the future of the SNP will hang on that.
Of course, that's the Margaret Ferrier by-election. Of course, she was she sort of decided to go on a travelling expedition whilst having COVID, which was totally off the menu, really. And she should have known that, but for some odd reason she decided to do that. Where do you see the Labour Party standing on this? Because they must be... Keir Starmer has literally done pretty much nothing and come up with policies that he's rode back on pretty much every time, and yet he is now the beneficiary of all of this. He could have just sat there and kept his mouth shut, which he didn't, but even when he opened it, he's managed to appear to reap the rewards. He must be quite happy with watching all of this.
I should imagine he's having an absolutely lovely weekend at the moment, sitting there, rubbing his hands together and looking at what gains he can make in Scotland, which, as you remember, Labour used to have a massive stronghold in Scotland and through their own behaviours lost it. The Conservative Party never really understood Scotland, so have never done particularly well there. So it's now all for Labour to win. They just have to get together and understand what their messaging is going to be. So it was a very good day for Keir Starmer's Labour Party to row back on all of their green agenda and their fiscal economy and all of those announcements. It was buried under the Boris Johnson news. So that hasn't had any scrutiny. So I hope that they'll be using this weekend to actually put some words together, put some policies together. But let's see, this is now theirs to lose rather than anyone else's to win.
And I don't see them losing it, because even the things they've been saying, nobody seems to be taking much notice of them, but they're still gaining ground. For example, the policy with regard to North Sea oil and gas. Keir Starmer's backpedalled on all his policies with regard to tuition fees, green taxes, and now this latest one, whereas Scotland's independence kind of rested on the notion that they would make money from North Sea oil. Do you think that the people of Scotland will even be considering that when they go to the ballot box to vote? Or do you think they've just probably had enough of the SNP after all of this?
I think there's a little bit of both. There will be those industries that are massively affected by North Sea oil and gas and those families who rely upon it for their income. But also they're going to be looking at the SNP having not delivered what it was they promised. So I think it's a little bit the same as within the rest of the United Kingdom, that they don't like the party that's in power, but nobody else is really exciting them either. So I think you'll see a really low turnout. People just are not engaged with politics in that way anymore, enough to go out to the ballot box. So I think really Labour need to look at what really matters to those people and come up with specific policies for Scotland if they're serious about winning it.
Or the alternative is he could just do another U-turn and U-turn the policy and not bother with it. Pretty much like all the policies that he's come up with. And with regard to Boris, if we might as well have a quick look at what's happening with Boris. Do you think that Boris will eventually be hounded out of politics altogether? Because it looks that way to me. Do you think he will bother? Because a lot of people are saying that he might try and stand in one of the seats, in another seat instead of his own, to get himself back into politics. Do you think that is a likely thing?
No, I think he's set fire to every bridge of coming back certainly into Conservative politics by launching those grenades of by-elections onto the current Prime Minister. I think he's had his moment. And I think Nigel was quite right with what he said. There's an awful lot of tactics, but no real plan as to what he's going to do next. The problem with setting up a new party, which is what you were speaking to Nigel Farage about, is that takes an awful lot of work to do. And Boris Johnson is incredibly good at communication, but not so much at administration. So I think that he will happily go off and be still around the arena of politics, just not directly elected, which probably will suit him better.
Claire Pestell, thank you very much. Good to talk to you. She's a political commentator. Thank you so much. If you've just joined me, welcome on board. Joining me in the studio, Martin Daubney and Nigel Nelson. Nigel, she said that you had a good idea there. Surprise, surprise. She has to say that. She's married to you.
Well, it's a question of what Boris Johnson does next. I mean, there's been a lot of speculation about would he try and get Nadine Dorries a seat in mid-Bedfordshire? No. Nominations will close by 5 o'clock tomorrow. There is no way that Boris Johnson will do that. What he's left himself open to is to find a seat somewhere else. So what he really needs is not a seat with a 7,000 majority, which he had in Uxbridge, which he would he'd lose. He needs a seat of 20,000, 25,000 when he'd have a good chance of winning it. What I think will happen is that we may have come to the end of the number of people who will quit immediately with Nigel Adams, Nadine Dorries. But it's worth looking at people like Sir Bill Cash, who's announced that he's going to leave Parliament at the next election. He could make way for Boris in his seat. Bill's 82, so he's getting on a bit anyway. He could make way for Boris down the road. The question then comes down to, do Tory MPs want Boris back? My impression is not. So whatever Boris is up to, he leaves his options open, but they could easily be closed off by his own party.
I think it might be more than that. I think it might be just the end of the Conservative Party as we know them. They don't stand for what a lot of voters believe them to be. Certainly, if you look to the kind of on-your-bike Thatcherism, the entrepreneurial, the aspirational, the nation-building, the patriotic party, that's dead. They don't exist anymore. Well, there are certain MPs that have those values. John Redwood is one of them, but there aren't many of them left. And so the prospect, I think, of building something fresh. Don't forget, in Italy, Meloni swept in from nowhere. In Sweden, a new party swept in from nowhere. In Holland, off the back of the farmers' revolution, a new party swept in from nowhere. Now, of course, that's difficult with first past the post, but with Boris at the helm, the donors will be queuing up. And don't forget that Nigel and Boris know a lot of big donors and they share a lot of big friends with big checkbooks. I think that would really motivate voters who want something fresh. They want a revolution. So we don't want more of the same. We're bored of the same. The none of the above party, the apathy, I think, is a huge, huge problem.
So what about, so you think that potentially Boris could go to reform and it could become could almost potentially be a super party, actually, and be an option for voters?
I think if that happened, there's a lot of leaps of faith here. Right? A lot. Now, I know that.
Yes.
But if that happened, I think people out there will be queuing up to vote for that party.
You think so? Well, listen, stay tuned. This is GB News. We're live on TV, online and on digital radio. We are the People's Channel. If you've just tuned in, just listen to your radio, literally, Nicola Sturgeon has been arrested without charges. We know she's not guilty of anything. Stay tuned. Loads more still to come here on GB News. Don't forget, you can check us out on the GB News app or stream the show live on YouTube. More to come in the next hour.
Good afternoon to you. Good evening, I should say. It's 5 o'clock. I'm Aaron Armstrong in the GB newsroom. As we have just been hearing, Nicola Sturgeon's been arrested by police investigating SNP finances. The former First Minister is in custody, being questioned by detectives. A spokesperson for the former SNP leader says she voluntarily attended an interview and has consistently said she will cooperate with the investigation. In April, her husband, Peter Murrell, who was the party's chief executive, and ex-treasurer Colin Beattie were questioned and released without charge pending further inquiries. Her home and the SNP headquarters were also searched, with police removing boxes of evidence. 3 British tourists are missing after a dive boat burst into flames in the Red Sea off Egypt. Officials say 12 Britons were rescued, along with 12 Egyptian crew and guides. It's understood the fire was caused by an electrical short circuit. The Foreign Office has confirmed it's in contact with Egyptian authorities and is assisting those involved. One of Boris Johnson's allies says the resignations recently of 2 Tory MPs wasn't a coordinated attempt to undermine the Prime Minister. Jacob Rees-Mogg insists there's no plot against Rishi Sunak and believes he should remain leader. He also believes Mr Johnson could easily get back into Parliament at the next election. The former Prime Minister announced he was stepping down as an MP after being handed the findings of the Partygate inquiry. Sir Jacob says there could be a split, though, if some MPs try to block Johnson's return, but admits things could have been done better.
One always deserves blame for one's own mistakes. It would be absurd of me to pretend that Boris hasn't made mistakes. There was a man called Peter Wentworth who in the late 16th century was locked up in the Tower for saying in the House of Commons, "None is without fault, no, not our gracious Queen." The same could be said of Boris. None is without fault, no, not our gracious Boris. That is true of all of us.
Leader of the Lib Dems, Sir Ed Davey, though, says people have had enough of the Tories.
Conservatives are totally divided, completely chaotic and letting people down. When they've got the cost of living crisis, the crisis in the NHS, the Conservatives seem unable to give the lead that Britain needs.
Meanwhile, Leave campaigner Nigel Farage believes it's the end for Boris Johnson with the Conservatives. However, the GB News presenter told Camilla Tominey he's been talking to Tory MPs about potentially joining a new party.
The good side of Boris, of course, is, well, just look at today's newspapers.
Yes.
He's very good at dominating news.
Yeah.
He does have personality. He does make people smile. And if he wants to defend his Brexit legacy, well, I want to defend my Brexit legacy too. So would there be a possibility of a new coming together on the centre-right? It'd be Boris Johnson. There'd be other MPs that would join in with this as well.
Have you discussed this with Boris Johnson?
Not with him directly, no. But I have discussed it with people very close to him.
Ukraine says its offensive against Russia is underway. President Volodymyr Zelensky says he's optimistic about regaining lost territory. It's after Ukraine claimed its forces had advanced up to 2,000 metres along the front line near the eastern city of Bakhmut. Russia, though, is disputing those claims. And the Met Office is warning that almost a month's worth of rain could fall over parts of the UK in the next 12 hours. It comes as temperatures continue to climb. 30 degrees recorded in Suffolk earlier, and we understand the temperature could go up and reach 32. The yellow thunderstorm alerts have been issued for areas in Scotland, Northern Ireland, England and Wales, and they'll be in force until 9 p.m. tomorrow. And a volcano in Hawaii is putting on a spectacular show. Big Island erupted early on Wednesday. Look at that, spewing ash and a river of lava. The volcano, located in a closed national park, is one of the world's most active. Lava flows are expected to remain confined to the surrounding crater. This is GB News. More as it happens, as always. But now, it's back to Nana.
Good afternoon and welcome. This is GB News on TV, online and on digital radio. I'm Nana Akua, and for the next hour, me and my panel will be bringing you the very latest on the Nicola Sturgeon arrest. Joining me today is broadcaster and author Christine Hamilton, also broadcaster and journalist Danny Kelly. Stay tuned. We'll be bringing you all of the latest with regard to the arrest, and we'll be also speaking to my political editor, Tom Harwood.
Well, there's been an investigation into SNP party finances and possible fraud within them since 2021. That's when Police Scotland launched what's known as Operation Branchform. It's so far led to 3 arrests, not just Nicola Sturgeon today, but of course her husband, Peter Morell, at the start of April, and also the former treasurer of the party as well. So those 3 arrests have taken place, 2 of them in April and 2 released without charge. But also, of course, at the same time, there have been quite rigorous searches of the party HQ and of Nicola Sturgeon and Peter Morell's private home as well. So some big questions in what has been quite a lengthy investigation, which doesn't really show any signs of slowing down as things stand. What we have seen in the last few minutes or so is responses from both the Scottish Labour Party and the Scottish Conservative Party. The Scottish Labour Party, for their part, are saying Humza Yousaf must urgently come clean about what he knew. The current First Minister, of course, has been seen as very close to Nicola Sturgeon. Many people cast him as the continuity candidate in the leadership election that took place upon her resignation. How much did he know? How close was he to the events? That's what the Scottish Labour Party want to know, whereas the Scottish Conservative Party have said Humza Yousaf must now show some leadership and suspend Nicola Sturgeon's membership of the SNP. So the Scottish Tories calling for Humza Yousaf to suspend Nicola Sturgeon as a member of the SNP following her arrest earlier this afternoon. That's just a flavour of reaction north of the border from the political parties. But of course we will see potentially some knock-on reaction from the people of Scotland in what many people expect is a rapidly approaching by-election in the seat of Margaret Ferrier, the MP, the SNP elected MP, now now independent, who was found to have broken all of those COVID rules, taking that test, meant to isolate, but instead travelling hundreds of miles on public transport across the country. She received a 30-day suspension from the House of Commons in the last couple of weeks, and that triggers, of course, a recall petition, and it could well be that her constituents in Scotland get to have their say on the whole mess of Scottish politics and indeed the mess within the SNP.
And of course, the mess within the whole political spectrum. If you look at it, a lot of those big leaders seem to be imploding. If you just joined us, welcome aboard. It's coming up to 8 minutes after 5 o'clock. Now, it's always interesting to find out how we are perceived outside this country and across the other side in the States. So let's go and have a chat with the host of the Politics People podcast, Paul Duddridge, to find out what the take is on America. In America, listen, Paul, we've had the big news that Nicola Sturgeon from the SNP has been arrested. Of course, back there, you've got Donald Trump, who has been arrested. We've had Boris Johnson, who's been up in front of the Privileges Committee, and his fate will be sealed or unsealed on Monday, even though he's resigned now. I mean, it does seem to feel like a whole sort of implosion of all these big names and big figures. Is this sort of news in the States when they hear about Nicola Sturgeon, or doesn't anybody care over there?
Oh, listen, I have to say, Nicola Sturgeon hasn't quite hit the wires yet in America. Boris Johnson's resignation has. Look, no disrespect to her, but yes, it hasn't quite. But I remember the days when it was only Donald Trump being arrested and forced to undergo a show trial. And now it's caught on everywhere. Everybody's doing it. It's always first in America. So once again, we are leading the world, pioneering the new branch of politics, where political opponents are able to take down, they don't even need a vote anymore. They can take down their opponents wherever they are, just by using the courts and judiciary. So it's we're entering a brave new world of political activism. But yes, no, Nicola Sturgeon hasn't quite, the significance of that hasn't quite hit yet. But yes, Boris Johnson is definitely a talking point over here.
Yeah, so they are talking about Boris. And then let's talk about Trump then, because he's been indicted now again. And they're potentially saying that he could spend up to 100 years in prison. What is it that he's supposed to have done? It feels like maybe nothing, but they're trying to make out it is something. So what is it that he's supposed to have done?
Well, he's a lot of these charges involve espionage. Okay, so he's up for 30. I think there's like 37. There's 37 charges emanating from 31 actions. 31 activities, and they basically are covered by the Espionage Act. And he has been found to have mishandled documents that might have a sensitive military nature, etc., and threaten the safety and security of the United States. And for that, he's been indicted. He's going to appear. I know you've got a whole flurry of activity over there, but he's going to actually be in court in Miami, in federal court in Miami on Tuesday, to have these charges officially, formally put to him. But yes, he's supposed to have threatened the security of the US by this misstorage of documents, etc. Unlike former Vice President Biden storing similar documents with his Corvette, and unlike Hillary Clinton smashing devices, according to the FBI, smashing devices as Secretary of State with a hammer. Can't imagine why she's done that. It's obviously just some sort of happy Friday afternoon ritual and nothing to do with trying to secrete any kind of information. But Trump uniquely is a former president who's now being tried under the Espionage Act. So everything is completely above board, very jolly, nothing to do with the fact this happened on Thursday. Nothing to do with the fact that finally the Biden documents were released by the FBI to Congress, finally, to the Oversight Committee, investigating a Biden bribery connection. This is the allegation, a $5 billion bribery connection. That news was released on Thursday, but somehow it's been kept out. It's been overshadowed by the indictment of former President. Some say former president, but anyway, Donald Trump.
Well, it'll be interesting to keep our eyes on that as well. Thank you very much. That's Paul Duddridge. He's the host of the Politics People podcast. Thank you so much. If you've just joined us, welcome on board. We've had some breaking news. Nicola Sturgeon has been arrested. She has not been charged with anything. She went voluntarily, and we are following that story here on GB News. Coming up to 12 minutes after 5 o'clock. Let's get some reaction from my panel, author and broadcaster Christian Hamilton and journalist and broadcaster Danny Kelly. Gosh, Danny, I mean, look, we are talking about Nicola Sturgeon now in this way. She has been arrested. I'm sort of thinking, you know, British politics feels like it is on a sort of edge, on a precipice that's about to sort of, everything's about to go over the edge, really.
There's an implosion around the corner in British politics. It was so fascinating to hear your colleague Nigel Farage talk about potentially doing a deal. Now, I know I'm probably mischaracterising what he said, but, you know, in layman's terms, he's open to approaching Boris Johnson to maybe have some sort of new political party.
Or to be part of Reform.
Correct. Now, I genuinely think that the Conservative Party, should they lose at the next election, I can see the Tory party as we know it not getting into power maybe ever again, because there is an offshoot, if you like, of Conservatives who want Brexit doing and doing as they were promised back in 2016. And, you know, if you've got big hitters like Nigel Farage, charismatic individuals with booming big personalities, you've got Boris Johnson, you've got Nigel Farage, they will take a lot of Conservative voters away with them. And I honestly can see the Conservative Party ending as it is.
Do you think that this is a signal of the end of the Conservatives? But they're not going to make any ground in Scotland, that's for sure. Scottish people never vote Tory, so they're not going to pick up any of the SNP votes. Maybe not. There's Alba, that other little party that Alex Salmond is hosting. He may well find he gets some people from this as well. But do you see this as like the end of the Tories? Because there's nowhere they can get any support.
Well, the Tories, the current Tories, they are their own worst enemy. They have brought this upon themselves. One of the reasons why the Tory party is completely riven asunder is because they are not Conservative anymore. They are not delivering Conservative politics. So no wonder that the true Conservatives, people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who we heard from earlier, no wonder the true Conservatives are fed up and the whole thing is busting asunder. And we've got the highest tax rate for 70 years. How Tory a policy is that, for heaven's sake? And they just simply are not behaving like Conservatives should. So the party is imploding. It's its own fault. Now, as for getting together, now, you know, some people know, you introduced him earlier, my husband is the leader of UKIP. Now, they have UKIP, they have the Reform Party, they have Reclaim, they've got, what they should have is this rump of Tories, and they should get together, because if they don't get together, they will not make an impact. They have got to join up. And Neil has been trying to get the other parties to do this for months and months, and they all need their heads banging together. Then there is some hope that a really, you know, centre-right party will make some ground.
You might end up with a sort of centre-right Labour-style party that got so different factions of it just keep disseminating into all sorts of angles and nothing ever happens. But joining us now is our Scottish political commentator, Ian McWhirter. Ian, so big news in Scotland, a surprise in terms of the timing, not a surprise as the fact that Nicola Sturgeon's been arrested without charge, I might add. Talk to me about what the reaction is there and what really, how you feel in terms of Scottish politics as it moves forward.
Well, it's come at a very delicate moment for the Scottish National Party, because it's facing a very difficult by-election in Rotherglen in the near future, almost certainly, as a result of Margaret Ferrier, who you may remember broke COVID rules during lockdown, and she was suspended by Parliament, and that's going to lead to almost certainly to by-elections. And their opinion polls are waning, and let's put it no stronger than that. Support for independence has not been particularly damaged as such. But I don't think these metrics really grasp the significance of what's happened with Nicola Sturgeon being arrested. I mean, before she resigned as leader in February, only a few months ago, she dominated, and the SNP dominated politics at every level in Scotland, without challenge from within or without the party. The opposition parties, Labour and the Conservatives, flat on their backs. She'd won 8 elections in a row and was heading for another election victory. Then she suddenly departed the scene and plunged her party into chaos. And it's not just a chaos, I think, solely for Scotland, because you have to remember Nicola Sturgeon was this real progressive icon. The left, particularly in the metropolitan media, have always looked to her as being, you know, this kind of perfect figure of a female politician who can do no wrong. And here she is today. She's been arrested by police. Now, you know, we have to repeatedly stress that we cannot comment in any way on the subject of this investigation. The Police Scotland keep issuing solemn edicts backed up by the Crown Office saying that, you know, you can face 2 years in prison if you speculate about the guilt or innocence of any of the people involved in this investigation, Operation Branchform, or any of the evidence involved in it. But what they can't do, what the police cannot do, is simply deny the significance of what they've been doing. This is hugely damaging to the Scottish National Party and to the Scottish Government, and particularly to Humza Yousaf, who's had his own difficulties recently and has been trying to get his feet under the table. And this is just another savage blow to his and their credibility.
Well, I was going to mention him as well, because, as you said, a savage blow to his credibility, which wasn't really at a very high level anyway. But what about, is it likely that he may find that he's going to struggle to survive as leader, and that perhaps someone like Kate Forbes, who came second in the leadership race, might be a candidate that people might rally behind, because people might still associate Humza with Nicola Sturgeon. He's obviously the continuity character.
Yeah, well, this is why it's so damaging for Humza Yousaf, because he was the continuity candidate. He was the leadership's choice to replace Nicola Sturgeon. As far as we understand it, he was her choice. Certainly, she backed him very strongly when he prevailed, only narrowly over the other candidates in that leadership election. But I don't think Kate Forbes or any of the others involved in it really would have the stomach to reopen a leadership contest now while this investigation is continuing. Until this is resolved one way or the other, I mean, Scottish politics really is on hold, and the SNP cannot move, not least because Humza Yousaf cannot say anything about it. And they couldn't conceivably have a leadership election while this investigation is going on. Indeed, just going through a by-election in Rotherglen, which, as I said earlier, is likely now on the horizon. That's extremely difficult in a position like this because, they have a 5,000 vote majority over Labour, but Labour are very confident of winning back this seat. They won it in recent times. And that could start a kind of chain reaction which would lead to the SNP losing a whole raft of seats, 10 to 20 seats, according to the opinion polls, at the next general election. And there's no real way in which you can get around that until this is resolved, which is why so many people in this higher reaches of the SNP had been pretty obviously attacking the police for conducting this investigation, saying this is, you're interfering in politics here. Murray Foote, who's the former spin doctor for the party and a former communications boss, said that, he thought this was turning into a wild goose chase. Noel Dolan, who's Nicola Sturgeon's former senior advisor, and actually no great friend of hers now, they fell out rather badly. He has condemned the police investigation, the erection of this forensics tent outside our home, all the rest, the success, the length of time this investigation has gone on. He said that was a circus, that it's over the top and it's outrageous that the police should be doing this. Now, as I say, we go to jail if we say anything. If we say anything that they don't like about this, they'll be down on us like a ton of bricks. And this happens. I mean, Craig Murray, a very prominent Scottish blogger, was actually locked up for contempt for passing comments on the previous arrested SNP leader, former leader Alex Salmond, a couple of years ago. So, everyone's in extreme state of tension about commenting at all about this. But you have to comment about the politics. It's unavoidable.
It really is, and it's such a time in politics as well. We shall keep with this story. Ian McWhirter, thank you very much for joining me. He's a Scottish political commentator. Well, also joining me now is former Brexit Party MEP Ben Habib. Ben, thank you very much for joining me. Welcome on board here at GBNews. It's just coming up to 22 minutes after 5 o'clock. If you've just tuned in to the news that Nicola Sturgeon has been arrested without charge, of course. Ben Habib, your reaction, please.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that her entire time in office, Nicola Sturgeon has championed the signalling of all forms of virtue. And we all know that while she was doing that, actually the economy, the schooling system, the health service in Scotland was suffering. But she masked all of that with her virtue signalling. She became the wokest leader of the devolved authorities, including, the Prime Minister we have in Westminster. And all of it was designed to hide her inability to govern. And now we realise, actually, it was hiding something much more sinister than just her ability to govern, but some fundamental failing in straightforward, moral correctitude. You know, here's someone who resigned a few months ago claiming that she'd had enough of politics, she wanted to spend more time with her family, all the usual excuses. But the reality was she knew this arrest was coming. She must be corrupt. And she was hiding all that corruption. And we have this completely blown out of the water.
No, hold on one second.
But of course,
Ben.
it's very bad.
Ben, first of all, just to stop you there, obviously this is a live investigation, so we don't comment on what the outcome could potentially be. But also Nicola Sturgeon said, and this is from her spokesperson, he said that Nicola Sturgeon said that the former SNP leader voluntarily attended an interview with Police Scotland and that she would cooperate with the investigation. And it is pretty much standard practice that if, you can be arrested but not charged. I mean, there are many people who are arrested and not charged, including the lovely Christine Hamilton, who joins me, and Neil, her husband. They were arrested together and not charged. So the fact is that she hasn't been charged yet, and there's no indication that there is any real proper evidence for corruption at all.
I didn't say she was guilty of this crime. I said she was morally corrupt. And I still hold by that. The way she promoted all these minority rights, it masked the failure of SNP governance in Scotland, and it seems to have masked something much more sinister than that as well. And remember, you had Martin Daubney on earlier, speaking incredibly sensibly about how net zero has damaged the United Kingdom. But of course, the province in the United Kingdom that it's damaged most is Scotland. Scotland has this fantastic treasury just off its own shores, and she championed net zero. She eschewed the fossil fuels that would have helped Scotland stay economically viable and grow, which would have created jobs in Scotland, which would have helped the prosperity of people who live in Scotland. That's the kind of leader she is. And when she resigned in February, please don't tell me she didn't know this was on the horizon. Of course she knew this is what was coming down the track. That's why she resigned.
She may not have known. She may not have known what was coming down the track.
Come on.
But she may not have known. As many of the party probably. I mean, I was very surprised, actually, myself, that obviously we realised something was coming because the other two members were also arrested. So that was an indication that she may well be next, seeing as she is married to the head of the party. But it is interesting that this particular time of politics seems to be very disruptive. So many of these big leaders, these big charismatic figures, seem to be sort of dissolving into this sort of abyss of nothingness. Do you think there's a future for the SNP now after she's gone, because we've got Humza in charge now?
Well, I hope there isn't a future for the SNP. Humza's on record complaining about the number of white people who are in various offices in Scotland. What kind of leader is openly racist against white people? I hope the SNP has no future. I'm sick of their virtue signalling. They were promoting a transgender rapist into a female-only prison. What kind of party is this? It's lost its compass completely. It doesn't deserve to be anywhere near office. They should be thrown out, and I hope the electorate will throw them out. Of course, it's very bad news for the Conservatives, because when the SNP go, as you mentioned earlier, Nana, when they leave office, it'll be the Labour Party that pick up the seats. It won't be the Tories. So it's been a really bad weekend for Rishi, with the damage done by Johnson and Johnson's supporters in the Conservative Party, and now Nicola Sturgeon going. It's all bad news for Rishi Sunak.
But great news for Sir Keir Starmer, who hasn't really lifted a finger. Thank you very much, Ben Habib. Really good to talk to you. He's the former Brexit Party MEP. Great to talk to you. And now a member of Reform. All right, well, let's get some reaction, because if you've just tuned in, you may not have listened to the radio or the TV and found out that Nicola Sturgeon has been arrested. So we'll find out what my panel think of that. Joining me in the studio, broadcaster Christine Hamilton, and also journalist and broadcaster Danny Kelly. Let's go to Christine Hamilton there. More reaction about Sturgeon's arrest, really.
Well, it wasn't a surprise. I mean, it's a surprise that it's happened this afternoon, especially given it's a Sunday. But, I mean, it was on its way, and I 100% think that Ben is right, that she knew something was coming down the tracks. Let's not say she knew exactly, because it's allegedly, etc., and she hasn't been, she's only been arrested, and people are arrested and they're completely innocent. She suddenly resigned just like that. It was most extraordinary. And then within a very short period of time, the house was searched. And I remember saying at the time on this channel exactly that, hang on a minute, nothing has been proved. People have their houses searched and there is nothing there. So, I mean, I'm a great champion of innocent unless proven guilty, because I've been, arrested myself, so I know. But I also think Ben is absolutely right. And I said earlier, I don't think the SNP has got any future up in Scotland. And I think their dream of independence is shattered. I think they've had it. I mean, Hamza Yousaf is utterly uncharismatic. He's just like Rishi Sunak. He's not going to, rouse the troops. They've lost their charismatic leader, and I think they're finished. And again, as Ben said, the people who are going to pick up the votes is Labour. I mean, Keir Starmer. I've always said Keir Starmer. The next election is his to lose, but even Keir Starmer, in his wildest dreams, cannot have imagined the last, whatever it is, 48 hours. I mean, it is just a massive majority is falling into his lap. And talking about lack of charisma, we'll have another one.
Well, it's all about time, isn't it? Because you get one that's really high in charisma. It's like when you go out with someone, who's there, you think, I'm not going to do that again. Then you go for the completely opposite, and that's just as bad. Well, this is what we've got. So we've seen what happens with Sturgeon. Now we've got Hamza Yousaf, who is the lack of charisma. We saw with Boris, now we end up with Rishi Sunak, who's lack of charisma. And now...
Sturgeon's not charismatic.
With Starmer, who's also lack of charisma.
Well, we've been talking about...
Well, she had a charisma.
Do you think she's charismatic, Nicola Sturgeon?
Well, she could rouse the troops. I mean, what
to the alternative, she's massively charismatic.
My test would be, do you want to go for a pint with them? And just for once looking at things objectively, there's a lot of subjective chatter going on. And I admire Ben. I'm a big fan of Ben's, but I think he should rein things back a little bit because the woman hasn't been charged yet. And Ben said moral corruption. How can you conclude that someone is morally corrupt until you know the findings of anything?
Well, I think he's more talking about her policies with the gender recognition reform bill, which to me I think is just a ridiculous thing.
No, that's right, but that's got nothing to do with...
He did point that out, and I did bring that to his attention, so we were talking about that. So I think that's where he was going with that, and some of the policies that she's come out with, which seem somewhat a bit odd, and of course with the Scottish people. I mean, the gender recognition reform bill, for goodness sake, he even identified the fact Isla Bryson, who was...
He's a bloke.
Well, he was a bloke, and then he just changed his name. He's a bloke. Just decided that when, on his arrest that now he's a woman, and that was taking advantage of something that she should have seen as a...
Oh, I see. Yeah, she tied herself in. But this is what these rabid lefties do. They tie themselves in knots. And as soon as the simple question, what is a woman? They just are petrified. They turn to stone. And there was no doubt that lad is still a lad. The famous photograph of him wearing a pink wig in tight tracksuits, that's a bloke. That's a lad.
He's a lad. He wasn't really trying, and he knew. Obviously, with the recognition reform bill, it made way for people who want to take advantage of
Of course it did.
Remember, Hamza Yousaf also fell into the trap of the whole thing about whether Isla Bryson was a woman or not. So they are all falling into this abyss.
It's a rabbit hole. They can't get out of it.
But Keir Starmer's also in that rabbit hole.
Of course he is.
He couldn't say it about a woman, so he's the one who's the beneficiary of all of this.
Of course he is. Sorry, Christine.
Well, what is so extraordinary about Sturgeon and Hamza Yousaf is that they couldn't see the rabbit hole that was approaching. OK, they want to give real transgender people, space, etc. I understand all that, but how could they not see, with all their advisors and goodness knows, how could they not see that trying to send that woman to that man to a woman's prison was a nonsense on stilts?
Especially with him being a double rapist as well. It just makes no sense. But listen, stay tuned. Of course, the breaking news that Nicola Sturgeon has been arrested. She has not been charged. A spokesperson for us, Nicola Sturgeon, said the former SNP leader voluntarily attended an interview with Police Scotland and that she would cooperate with the investigation. Well, stay tuned. Let's find out more. Get our latest news headlines with Aaron Armstrong.
3 British tourists are missing after a dive boat burst into flames in the Red Sea off Egypt. Officials say 12 Britons were rescued, along with 12 Egyptian crew and guides. The Foreign Office has confirmed it's in contact with the Egyptian authorities and is assisting those involved. One of Boris Johnson's allies says the resignations of 2 Tory MPs wasn't a coordinated attempt to undermine the Prime Minister. Jacob Rees-Mogg says there's no plot against Rishi Sunak and that he should remain as leader. He also suggested, though, that Mr Johnson could easily return to Westminster and could easily get back into Parliament at the next election. Well, as you've just been hearing, Nicola Sturgeon's been arrested by police investigating SNP finances. The former First Minister's in custody, being questioned by detectives. A spokesperson for Ms Sturgeon says she voluntarily attended an interview and has consistently said she'll cooperate with the investigation. In April, her husband, Peter Murrell, who was the party's chief executive, along with the ex-treasurer Colin Beattie, were questioned and released without charge pending further inquiries. Her home and the SNP headquarters were also searched. Police were seen removing boxes of evidence. And the Met Office has warned that almost a month's worth of rain could fall over some parts of the UK in the next 12 hours. And that is as temperatures continue to climb, so it may bring some respite from the heat. 30 degrees recorded in Suffolk earlier. It's thought it could still reach 32. Yellow thunderstorm alerts have been issued and they'll be in force until 9 p.m. tomorrow. More on all of our stories on our website, gbnews.com. Now back to Nana.
Hello, good afternoon. This is GB News. We are the People's Channel. Don't forget you can download the GB News app or stream the show live. I'm Nana Akua. And of course, we've had the breaking news that Nicola Sturgeon has been arrested. We're still talking about this hour. Former SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon, yes, she's been arrested in the investigation into the SNP's finances. And Police Scotland have said this. An SNP spokesperson said these issues are subject to a live police investigation. The SNP have been cooperating fully with this investigation and will continue to do so. However, it is not appropriate to publicly address any issues whilst that investigation is ongoing. Of course, we will honour that. Well, I'm joined in the studio now by Nigel Nelson and also Martin Daubney. Martin, I mean, it's been a big afternoon for politics. In fact, a whole big weekend. It literally started on Friday, but then it's been going on actually the whole week. Starting with ITV and Holly Willoughby.
Yeah.
Seriously. Well, they're going to court, aren't they? On Wednesday, they're going to be,
And Prince Harry.
And Prince Harry. So we've had a big week.
But politically extraordinary.
Yeah.
Donald Trump indicted for the second time. Seismic event there. Boris pulling the ripcord, getting out of Uxbridge. Amazing. Nicola Sturgeon now. And also, don't forget that the leader of formerly the Green Party, Caroline Lucas, also threw the hat in, because basically all the parties are the Green Party now. So they're no longer required. But an extraordinary seismic time of great change. And when great change comes, one thing I've been struck by during your show is Keir Starmer may as well be a waxwork dummy. He doesn't need to do anything. He doesn't need to say anything. He's just basically watching the rest of them turn into a car crash. It's just like fireball of the opposition. And he's just sort of laughing and sitting there and not having to say anything. Where are the policies from the Labour Party? We've seen the policy in Scotland. No more North Sea oil or gas. Seems like a terrible idea to me. What about prosperity? Let's get that out of the ground and have a future nation built on wealth.
Well, let's not forget his policy with removing charitable status of private schools.
Yeah, I mean,
as it was calculated this week, actually, that it would actually not really bring much money in at all. Keeps going on about non-dom status as well, removing that and getting the money off people, and it doesn't.
But in the red wall, don't forget, people lent their vote to Boris. Brexiteers loaned their votes in places like Ashfield, where I stood. It was, let's get Brexit done. I don't think Boris did get Brexit done. I think he fudged it on fishing. He fudged it on Northern Ireland, on the level playing field, on our tax status, on our ability to be sovereign and govern our own laws. I digress.
Regulation as well.
Yeah, I digress. But we're seeing a huge moment of turnover. And I think, as I said, the waxwork dummy Keir Starmer can walk in and just hoover up votes. But where's the aspiration in voting for Labour? I personally don't see it.
Well, the aspiration is that they're the only ones left. Yeah. I'm joined now by political commentator Emma Webb. Emma Webb, reaction on Nicola Sturgeon. She has been arrested without charge, by the way. She went voluntarily. There's no talk that she has been charged at all. And we obviously don't want to prejudice the investigation. So what's your take on all of this as you're watching?
What an extraordinary weekend in politics. I don't remember seeing anything like this. And I think that Martin there hit the nail on the head, which is that really this is a gift to Keir Starmer. And if he does win the next general election, even if he wins with a landslide, it will be the most undeserved election victory in history, because he is just profiting off of the absolutely astronomical failures of the other parties. And so I think that the concern here is that, the silver lining is that the likelihood of another independence referendum is becoming slimmer and slimmer by the day. But on the other hand, this is devastating for the Conservatives. Not that they do particularly well in Scotland, but the sheer number of gain seats that could possibly turn back to the Labour Party could put the Labour Party into a position where then we're not looking at a hung parliament anymore. This really changes everything. And I thought it was quite extraordinary watching the change in tone of Humza Yousaf's comments earlier today, suggesting that they could possibly give the Labour Party a hard time if they weren't really willing to cow to their demands for another independence referendum, or to devolve further powers to Scotland. And now look at what's happened. I think that as a story, I haven't seen anything age quite so quickly.
It really has, and it's moving quickly. I mean, I don't know when we'll get some sort of response with regard to that investigation, but we will keep focusing on that here at GB News. I'm wondering, though, do you see this as the end of the SNP then? Because obviously they don't really have they have the agenda of independence, but there are other little parties like ALBA, Alex Salmond's party, that could potentially step into that void that will be left, obviously, and nobody's really supporting Humza. He's losing ground.
Well, you never really know, because things have become so unpredictable in our politics. So I wouldn't want to call it, but I do think that this could be a devastating blow to them. I think that they could potentially, as you've been talking earlier about the Labour, the SNP MP who got herself in a spot of bother for violating COVID restrictions. If they have a by-election in that seat, which is looking quite likely, and that then tips back to the Labour Party, because of course that was again in the 2019 elections, and the margin is only around 5,000, so it's very possible that could go back to the Labour Party. I think you could see a landslide back, from that meteoric rise that one of your guests was describing earlier that we saw of the SNP. I think you could see as speedy a meteoric fall. So it's quite possible, but regardless, this is good for the Labour Party, because this is chaos on all fronts. And so the only way is up for the Labour Party. Keir Starmer must be licking his lips.
He's not able to say what a woman is, but he's still managing to get through because the others aren't able to do anything else by the looks of it. Do you think this is actually coming at a point where what this really is that sometimes some parties spend too long in power, and now we've come to a point where, I mean, the SNP, 10 years or so they've been hanging around. You've got the Labour Party, whether the Conservative Party, 13 years. It seems to be that area when it gets to around about 13 years when it all starts to go wrong.
I think if you remember before COVID, everyone was talking about the great realignment that was happening, not just here in the UK, but across the world, also in the States as well. The great realignment in our politics away from economic questions towards cultural fault lines. And I think that got frustrated by the pandemic. And I think what we're seeing now is partly what you've described. It's your parties like the SNP and even to some degree the Conservative Party, but the SNP more so because they've been allowed to really get off scot-free. They blame everything on England, and they have had massive failings in the school system, failings in the health system, and they've been very good with the PR of just covering that up, always trying to deflect back to the one issue that matters to them, to the detriment of absolutely everything else, including the Scottish people, which is independence. But I think what we're
Oh, we've just lost Emma Webb, but whilst she's talking about that, let's come to Nigel Nelson, because I wanted to ask you with regard to that. We're talking about the duration of time that these parties spend in power, and that seems to be some sort of absolute power corrupts absolutely. It seems that after a while, they seem to lose their way, and all the other things seem to start happening to them.
Yes, I mean, David Cameron said that prime ministers go around the twist a bit after 10 years, and I think he's absolutely right. They're tucked in a security bubble, they miss out on real life, and so that's what happens. Maggie Thatcher, 13 years, New Labour, 13 years. This government have been in just over that, and I think that you get tired, you run out of ideas, run out of steam, and then the electoral cycle moves on and somebody else takes over.
Well, it's interesting. I look at these electoral cycles, and I actually think that they are to blame for the sort of churn in our politics. So, for example, if you look at how many housing ministers we've had, was it 15? We've had like 8 Home Secretaries. I think that there needs to be... Do you think it's time for an actual change in politics, and we need to start looking at the whole system again? Because I feel like something needs to happen.
It'd be amazing if that could happen, but of course we are encumbered with the first past the post system, which means that unfortunately we have this depressing sort of flip-flopping, don't we, between blue and red, and nobody else really gets a sniff. Brexit policy managed that, of course, but that was proportional representation during a European election. Is there a future for PR in Britain? That would be fantastic. It would give us more of plurality, more people having a voice. But if we are heading towards a landslide for Labour, there's no way that's happening anytime.
Well, they're not going to do that. When you're in power, you don't change it then because it worked for you then, and obviously then that...
Which is why it never changes.
Keep it that way. Well, listen, I'm joined by former MSP, so member of the Scottish Parliament, Ross Thompson. Ross, thank you very much for joining me. So what's the energy like in Scotland? What is the reaction to this news there?
Well, thanks so much for having me on the show. It's great to be with you. And in terms of reaction, it's been really interesting. I've just come from meeting a group of friends and some of my sister's friends. She was having a baby shower. We all got the news through at the same time. And there was a lot of jubilation from some quarters, people who were delighted to see that this has finally happened. But overall, I think there's a sense of... this is something which is quite historic that's happened. This is now the second Scottish First Minister to have been arrested, the second time that an SNP leader has been arrested. It's quite an earthquake, really, in Scottish politics, and it's going to reverberate, as we go into elections which are coming up next year, as you know, as the SNP look to have another referendum on Scottish independence, or a party that has moralised and tried to show that is better than the Westminster establishment and trying to portray that to the people in Scotland, that they're better, that this is going to have a damaging impact on them and their reputation, clearly.
Do you think that the people in Scotland are ready to sort of look to the Labour Party instead? Because obviously the Labour Party's vote has been disseminated, it's gone. They've got, what is it, just one MSP there. So, do you think that people are now going to look to the Labour Party? Or do you think that the Tories might have some scintilla of hope?
I think it's going to be a mix. I think the primary beneficiary is going to be the Labour Party. We know there's parts of the Central Belt, so round about Glasgow, round about the central part of Scotland, where actually the Labour are going to be the main beneficiaries from the potential collapse in the support for the SNP at the next general election. There is still an opportunity for the Conservatives. We know that there's parts of Scotland, particularly rural Scotland, looking at areas around about Perthshire, Aberdeenshire, where the Tories will clearly want to target to benefit from this chaos that we're seeing within the SNP. But I think primarily where there's a huge cluster of seats in the central part of Scotland and in Glasgow, that yes, the Scottish Labour Party will be, I'm sure, rubbing their hands right now at this news and looking at the opportunities that are coming. And the by-election, which you already mentioned earlier in the programme, that's going to be happening potentially in Rutherglen and Hamilton, that's clearly, I think, that's something that Labour are keen to win and are probably in pole position to win at this point in time.
Now, listen, you talked about the independence referendum. Do you think that will still go ahead?
I think it is dead. It really is. I cannot see a path forward for the SNP, given what has happened with the Supreme Court, a clear judgment being made of where the authority lies for these kind of constitutional matters. That really did put a nail in the coffin for the SNP. But also now the crisis in leadership, the secrecy that we've seen within the SNP over its finances, Nicola Sturgeon being obviously the face of that, and that's something which has come out of this whole process, is that as much as she tried to spin to us that she was leaving politics because she wanted to get to know herself better and have some more coffees with her friends, when people look back on her legacy and time in office, it will be because of this. It will be because of this police investigation and her arrest today, the real reasons that she left. And that has obviously had an impact on trust. And voters' trust. And when you're trying to sell to people not just a manifesto of party political pledges on policy about something different, about creating a new, separate, independent state with the structures of a new state, and trying to convince the electorate that now is the time and that you're the right people to be trusted to do that, no way is that going to happen. Humza Yousaf has to sell that to keep his job as party leader, to try and keep his shrinking base supportive, and to try and keep them voting for the SNP this election next year. He's got to say that. But we all know that the reality is it's just not going to happen. And like Nicola Sturgeon, he'll lead the SNP voters up the hill, but he's not going to deliver for them.
Is there any chance for him to survive as leader? I don't know. Kate Forbes, do you think they might look to her instead? Maybe to have a refresh because he was the continuity character?
Yeah, well, we already know, because there's been reports here in the Scottish press about coups being planned already by allies close to Kate Forbes. People basically believing that Humza's leadership is going to be limited, probably up until the election, and then they will clearly look for change. I think most people would widely expect the SNP to perform quite poorly in the general election that's coming. They are going to lose a number of seats and notable personalities. I think he is temporary. He doesn't, have the support of the wider base of his party. His win in the leadership contest was really narrow, and right now he's got an awful lot of questions to answer. What did he know in relation to SNP finances, and when did he know it? Has he been part of this kind of cover-up that we've seen within the SNP? Because although right now this investigation is happening and we don't know if there's anything criminal taking place, what we do know is that there has been a culture of secrecy within the SNP, and that the leadership has been a clear part of that. That's why we've seen people resign their positions as treasurers. We saw Joanna Cherry resign from the NEC. We've seen disquiet for some time, but we know right now at the heart of the SNP there is this secrecy culture, and he has to answer questions about that, how he's going to address that and restore trust.
Well, we shall see, because all will be revealed in time. Ross Thompson, thank you very much. He's a former MSP. Really good to talk to you. Wow. Well, so much still to come here on GB News. But right now I'm joined by former editor of the Labour List, Peter Edwards. Peter, I'm wondering, I bet Peter's... he's one of your friends, isn't he?
Indeed he is.
Nigel.
Absolutely,
yeah,
yes.
I bet Peter's rubbing his hands with glee on this one as well.
I would imagine he will be. I was interested to see what Ross was saying there about independence being dead. What is a theme that's run through the entire show is trust in politics, and it's trust that's been lost.
Well, let's see what Peter thinks of that, because he's there with us from the Labour List. Peter Edwards, well, you must be happy. You're rubbing your hands with glee. Sturgeon appears to have... No, you're not. Really? No. But the Labour Party used to be pleased. Really?
So I disagree. Sorry, Nana, go on.
No, go on. You disagree. Carry on. I'd like to hear your view on
I disagree with most of what Ross said, because Labour should not be cock-a-hoop, because, first of all, Nicola Sturgeon's entitled to a fair process, and if in a week or two's time she's released without charge and it goes away in terms of the situation around her, Labour will lose the plank of its campaign. As all the comments have showed this afternoon, the governance scandal is much wider around the SNP, regardless of the one arrest we've had today. Nicola Sturgeon, for example, was married to the chief executive. That's just not good governance. We've had other arrests. The other thing it shows is the SNP's new leader, Humza Yousaf, is going to be completely backward-looking, because he's going to go into election trying to talk about the future. Every opponent, internal critics and media, will say what's happened about the finances. So it drags him and potentially independents back to a massive period of introspection with very uncomfortable questions about their finances. And I think we've got to zoom out from Nicola Sturgeon, because no one knows how this is going to turn out. But we do know the SNP is guilty of a colossal failure of governance that's going to haunt it for many years.
Well, that's true, actually. Obviously, their handling of the whole COVID crisis, a lot of governments fell foul of that as well. Their health service in real problems, as they are in England, actually, in all parts of this country. But do you see a future for the SNP in Scotland, though, given that all this sort of scandal seems to be emerging? And, first of all, they had the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, which, in fact, the Labour Party supported. Do you see that perhaps independence is something that people won't want to pursue in Scotland anymore?
Well, these things go in ebbs and flows, as you know. Remember, devolution, which I supported very strongly and I think has worked well, was supposed to be the thing that, quote-unquote, kills independence stone dead. That didn't happen. But it's not just that the unionists, like me and most of the main Westminster parties, won the referendum the last time round. It's like we're not even close to having another referendum. And the events of this weekend push another referendum back even further away, because Nicola Sturgeon was a fantastic communicator. She's mired in sleaze. Humza Yousaf, or called useless by his critics, is going to spend all his time talking about the past. Whoever is in power at Westminster said, you're not having enough referendum. So their only option would be a disgraced party having an illegal advisory vote, and perhaps with some parallels to what happened in Catalonia in Spain. And that would just prompt another period of chaos rather than fixing public services. So I think it's not just bad for the SNP today, but it's very bad for the next 5 or 10 years for the party's cause. But let's not be complacent. Independence might be dialed down, but it will never go away.
Well, listen, I can now tell you some breaking news that, as you were saying, that Nicola Sturgeon has actually been released without charge. So you're absolutely spot on to focus on that. But as we said, we did say, and we have been saying throughout the show, that Nicola Sturgeon's, people said a spokesperson for Nicola Sturgeon said the former SNP leader voluntarily attended an interview with the Police Scotland, and that she would cooperate with the investigation. So, Peter Edwards, thank you so much. Good to talk to you. You take care of yourself. This, of course, is GB News. We're live on TV, online and on digital radio. We've been covering Nicola Sturgeon's arrest. But now, Martin Talbley, your reaction sheet. Nicola Sturgeon has been released without charge.
Yeah, but the thing is, the perception and the whiff is what this is about. And we must remember in politics, nothing lasts forever. No, people thought Thatcher would last forever. When the end came, it was brutal and it was fast. Tony Blair, who transformed the country, when his time came, it was over. Boris Johnson, quickly, overnight, gone. Sturgeon may have been released, but the smell isn't good. And when you have that breakdown of trust, as Nigel mentioned so succinctly, and the issue of competence, which was exposed about the gender recognition stuff, and the failure to deliver on independence, single-issue party, and then the whiff of corruption and multiple arrests, I'm afraid that is a toxic combination, which I think will be a huge turn-off for the SNP, irrespective of the outcome of this particular investigation. I think the damage is done. The SNP, I think, is holed beneath the water to sinking ship.
I think Keir Starmer's just spat out his champagne. Nigel.
Well, I mean, I think Martin's absolutely right. The optics of this not very good. We must remember that Peter Morrell, Nicola Sturgeon's husband, was interviewed for 12 hours. So Nicola Sturgeon has only been interviewed for about 3 hours. So that must be significant. I think the only way of clearing the air completely is if the police turn around and say, we're not going to talk to her, we have no need to talk to her again. That's the only way the air will be completely clear, but under Scottish law, they can go straight back to her and rearrest her.
So, yeah, so this is something that, obviously, they're not finished with their investigations on this, so it's not, whilst she has been cleared for now, as far as we know.
Yeah.
She's been released, so
and it's important to point out as well, they would not have taken the decision to arrest her lightly. Now, this is not like a witch hunt. This is not some sort of cabal against the SNP. In fact, if anything, the SNP seems to have enjoyed, I think, a remarkably positive relationship with the police. So they wouldn't have taken this decision lightly, irrespective if she's been released or not. To the man and the woman in the pub, on the street, at the market, at the fish and chip shop, this is not a good look. I think that's the point. It sticks. That reputation sticks. That suspicion sticks. And when you go to the polling booth with your pen, I think people are going to change their minds.
That's what you hear, and that's what you remember. You remember the bad things. People always remember the taste of the bad things, and they stay there and they linger. And I think at this point, I mean, Hamza Yusuf, who is the sort of continuity character, may be thinking, thank goodness that's happened. But he will also be, people will still be asking questions because she has been released. But of course, her husband and another member of the SNP are still... they're still being questioned.
Yes, and just to finish up on the issue of trust again, that it is down to very much, do you trust these people? If you remember, Peter Morrell, when he resigned, it was not over anything to do with this. It was because he put false information out about SNP membership figures. So all these things chip away at people's sort of trust in the party. Integrity really is important.
It is really.
And I think once integrity is magnified and highlighted and under the microscope like that, then you start to look at other things. What's your ability to run the NHS, to run the schools, to get people off of drugs? Scotland's got a terrible, terrible problem with drug addiction and street violence. All of it then comes into focus, doesn't it? If the people at the top are under suspicion, then how can we trust you to do anything? I think once you have that tipping point, I mean, there will always be people, you could show fossils to a creationist and they would still believe in God, of course. You could show all this evidence to an SNP voter and many of them will still vote SNP. They're the dyed-in-the-wool, they're the blowhards. But you can't run a country on a minority vote. You need mass participation. They haven't got it.
Well, listen, I tell you, it's been a cracking few hours with
brilliant.
You guys. Thank you, and of course, with you at home. Fantastic, incredible development. Nicola Sturgeon, who was arrested earlier today, has been released without charge. So, listen, thank you to you for your company. It's been a pleasure as ever. I look forward to catching up with you on Saturday at 3 o'clock. Hopefully, you will join me there. This is GB News. We are the People's Channel. Gloria Meets is next.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the people's channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.